So once again, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining Christie House's Human Trafficking, Strides, Trends, and Gaps, an Education Symposium. I am very happy to be with you today. My name is Deborah Billings, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Director of Prevention and Education at Christie House. And today, I'll also be serving as your moderator, along with Jessica Heilton, one of our prevention team members. Good morning, Jess.
Good morning, everyone. Hi, Deborah. I'm so excited to be here.
Very good. Thank you. Next slide, please. Very good. Thank you. So Christie House is the Children's Advocacy Center of Miami-Dade County, and we are part of a network of over 900 advocacy centers nationwide. At Christie House, we are dedicated to healing and eradicating child abuse and child sex trafficking, working nationally on solutions and locally to heal child victims. As a child-centered coordinated response center, we are responsible for coordinating the child victims' legal, medical, and social service needs. Christie House is nationally recognized for our evidence-based therapeutic expertise in treating child trauma. And we are also one of the very first child advocacy centers in the country to address the commercial sexual exploitation of children. All of our services are provided at no charge to families. And if you'd like to learn more about Christie House, our programs, services, and educational offerings, please visit our website at christiehouse.org. Next slide, please. As I am doing the intro, I do encourage you to please take a moment and complete the pre-test survey. The link can be found in our chat box. So it's really important for us to take a moment to acknowledge and to thank our grantors, Christie House's Project Gold, and this presentation is supported by the U.S. Department of Justice Office for Victims of Crime, the Fred A. DeLuca Foundation, the Batchelor Family Foundation, Kathleen Kennedy Foundation, Key Biscayne Women's Giving Circle, the Miami Foundation, and Ocean Reef Community Foundation. Thank you very much to our grantors. Without your support, this presentation would not be possible. We appreciate you. Next slide, please. I do want to take a moment to introduce two of our very own, Ms. Teresa Kennedy. She's Christie House's Chief of Operations, and she's also serving as the Interim Director of Project Gold, and Burdell Canfield, Program Manager for Project Gold. And so both Burdell and Teresa will be leading session 3 later on today. So we are very happy that they're going to be with us. Thank you, ladies. Next slide, please. So let's take a moment, and I'd like to take the opportunity to share a little bit about Project Gold. Project Gold is a branch of Christie House. It is a membership organization for girls who have experienced or who are at risk for commercial sexual exploitation. And although Project Gold is a drop-in center and not a residential center, many sexually exploited girls still consider it their home. It is a place where girls are empowered to find their strengths in a non-judging, healing environment. Project Gold is victim-centered and survivor-led. It provides a home-like setting for engagement and delivery of restorative services, including case management, therapy, advocacy, transportation, educational, and recreational enrichment. It provides an alternative to a dangerous life of abuse and exploitation. And a little bit of background about the work that Project Gold has been able to accomplish in the past year. From July 2020 to March of 2021, Project Gold was able to provide services to 6,709 girls, and this includes 3,321 contact hours, which represents service work with and on behalf of the girls, involving counseling, mentoring, employment, coaching, tutoring, court advocacy, member trainings, and case staffings with our partners. Client drivers are a vital part of our program, and they offered 858 transportation trips, and 3,421 community members were trained in Commercial Sexual Exploitation 101 to further support the awareness and the prevention of commercial sexual exploitation of youth. So thank you to Project Gold and kudos, as well as all of the agencies that are represented here today with our panelists that support in the work towards the anti-trafficking movement. Thank you. Next slide, please. I do very much want to take a moment and introduce Christie House's prevention and education team. We are dedicated to spreading child abuse prevention, education, and awareness to adults and children, not only in the United States, but worldwide. Our presentations and our programming is available in English, Spanish, French, and Haitian Creole. Supporting us behind the scenes today is Sybil Bonhomme and Patricia Zedler. Good morning, ladies.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Next slide, please. Thank you, ladies. Thanks for all you do. All right. So before we get started, there's a few housekeeping items that I do want us to go over. To the participants, please know that during the event, your audio and video will be disabled. However, we encourage you to participate by sharing your comments using the chat feature and asking questions using the Q&A feature. Let us know which panelists you'd like to have address your question. If we're not able to answer all of the questions while online, we will compile the list, find the answers, and share as a resource on our website. Also, the webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to all participants, and it will also be available on our website. The day before yesterday and this morning, you should have received a Zoom reminder which contained a link for you to take the pre-test surveys. If you did not have the opportunity to take the pre-test survey, please take a moment and do so now. Patricia has probably dropped the link in the chat box now several times. You will use the same link for the post-test as you did for the pre-test. When you complete our surveys, you help us secure funding for our services, for our programs, education, and this is deeply appreciated. And finally, I sincerely hope that we do not have any technology issues, but if we do, please be patient while we work through them. We'll do the best that we can. Next slide, please. There we go. Thank you. Very good. So each of, oopsie, let me fix this. So each of our panelists represent different agencies that work together to combat human trafficking and support human trafficking survivors. Each are experts in their respective fields. For today, we ask that they present on strides, trends, and gaps from the field, as well as other timely and relevant topics. With this in mind, today's human trafficking event has 3 sessions. Session 1, we're going to have Florida laws and policies that address human trafficking. Session 2, providing services for all trafficking survivors. And Session 3, survivor-centered care and leadership. Each session will begin with a 20-minute presentation, and it's going to be followed by questions that I will ask the panelists. And then we will end with a Q&A segment with the panelists responding to questions that you, the audience, will ask them. So please, as you are listening to the panelists and you're listening to the discussion, please take a moment and write your questions in the Q&A so that the panelists can respond to them during the Q&A session. Next slide, please. To close this out. Very good. So at this time, I'm going to launch a poll just to get a better understanding of what area of expertise or what type of work you do within the anti-trafficking movement, also to find out what your area of interest are. So just give me a moment. And actually, Patricia, you're going to have to launch the poll for me, my dear, because I don't have it here. It's not showing it to me. Very good. Thank you. So please take a moment and respond to the poll. All right. I am not seeing the data compile, Patricia, so you're going to have to take it for me. Showing up on my end.
No problem.
Thank you. Very good, thanks. So what is your role in the anti-trafficking movement? I'm just going to go ahead and share the responses. 40% are advocates, 9% educator trainers, 4% are survivors, 15% therapists, 23% case management, 7% law enforcement, and 2% legal representation. So we have a fair mix of everyone, and most of you all are interested in all of the different subject matters that we will be presenting today. So that is great to know. Thank you for participating. I appreciate it. Hold on just a minute, and next slide, please. Very good. Okay. So session one, it is my pleasure to introduce the panelists for session one. We have Katina Hernandez. She's the special agent for Department of Homeland Security. We have Terry Coonan. He's a doctor, but he likes to be called Terry Coonan. He is the executive director for the Center of Advancement of Human Rights for the Florida State University. We also have Natalie Freitas, Esquire. She is the senior program attorney for Guardian ad Litem, and Ms. Maria Jose Fletcher, Esquire, co-director and founder of VIDA Legal Assistance, Inc. Thank you all very much for being with us today. I am so grateful. And Dr. Coonan, Terry, we're going to ask that you take it away. And we will be sharing your PowerPoint for you.
Great. Okay. Let's see. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Terry Coonan. I direct our Human Rights Center here at Florida State University, where for close to 20 years, we've done a great deal of work with both sex trafficking and labor trafficking victims. I currently serve on our statewide Human Trafficking Council as well. So it's a great privilege for me to get to join all of you today, including this panel, which is just full of experts. I'm especially pleased to be reunited with Maria Jose, who I believe is the institutional memory here in Florida for the anti-trafficking movement. Maria Jose has been one of the pioneers in the legal field, working with survivors of both sex and labor trafficking for several decades. So very happy to be with her and with our other panelists who are right where the rubber meets the road. I'd like to do a quick walkthrough kind of our laws and some of our trends here. Our Florida anti-trafficking statutes are all in one particular area of our law, 78706. The state basically integrated those. We used to have a number of separate statutes for labor trafficking and sex trafficking, but now, and it's a very good thing, they're all in one statute. Next slide. Okay, a quick look at the trends. My work, especially with our statewide council, involves tracking a lot of these for our legislative and our agency heads. A number of the recent trends, labor trafficking. We're having quite a few labor trafficking cases in Florida. They're being reported, not always investigated, and to be honest, rarely prosecuted. So that labor trafficking is an area where I think we have to think more. Traveling sales crews. These are U.S. citizen children, often from very impoverished neighborhoods. DCF tells us, and they've tracked these quite closely, how these U.S. citizen children are often being trafficked in sales crews that will often take them away from their home city, their home county, and they're being labor trafficked to go door to door in homes around Florida. Third area of trends, what we call community kids. DCF has recognized and has actually led the way in noting that probably more than 60% of the children who are identified as sex trafficking victims or at risk of sex trafficking here in Florida, they're not in our traditional dependency system. They're actually what we call community kids. They're still living at home. They're with a caregiver. It might be an elderly grandmother, it might be a single mother, but they're children that are being trafficked while they're still living with a caregiver. So that's a new challenge for DCF, and they've done some, I think, quite remarkable things to reach out to that group of trafficking victims that we now know is a considerably large group. Also boys. Nathan, our friend and colleague, will talk to us about that today. The recognition that we can't just think about women and girls, but that increasingly young males are also trafficked. The state attorney's office in Miami has done some landmark cases and actually prosecutions of traffickers who actually traffic boys and young men. I believe they'll have a chance to talk about those. Another trend, online recruiting of children. This has actually spiked during COVID, that because children were spending more time online and at times unsupervised, we're seeing more recruiting of children. And our DCF statistics seem to bear that out, that as the statistics have caught up with COVID, they've actually started to show that there has been an increase of online recruiting. There's also more advertising that we're now seeing on dating apps. Children, but also adults being advertised on dating apps. Once that Backpage was closed down by the federal government, much of the advertising for sex trafficking moved into that field of dating apps. So kind of a quick look at some of the trends that we're looking at, especially at the policy level here in Florida. Next slide. Okay, I'll do just a very quick run through on our trafficking statutes. They are very much a work in progress. They have been since 2004 when we enacted our first anti-trafficking statutes here in Florida. We have since added to them substantially almost every year. Our legislature has proved very good about revisiting this on an annual basis. Much of that because we continue to learn about how trafficking evolves, what victim needs are, what trends are for how perpetrators are engaging in trafficking, but also as we learn more about things like trauma, as people from the helping fields, if you can think of it that way, do a great deal more to inform us about how trauma continues to impact this world of human trafficking. As I mentioned before, Florida now has one statute for both sex trafficking and labor trafficking, and unlike other states, some states like Minnesota have tasked their Department of Health as being the lead anti-trafficking agency. DCF is our lead anti-trafficking agency in Florida, and doing, in my mind, a quite remarkable job. Every year, they're in many ways confronted with new trends, with new challenges, and they have, I think, been a tremendous stakeholder in our statewide response. Next slide. Okay, again, more strengths. Florida's criminal code now defines and describes human trafficking offenses in one section of the state law. And all trafficking offenses are now first-degree felonies, meaning that traffickers can get up to 30 years imprisonment and level 8 to 10 sentencing, again, for those of us in the legal world. That's very important. Usually the law is about 20 years behind the situation on the streets. And fortunately, we now have laws that are commensurate, penalties that are commensurate with the kind of harm that traffickers do to victims and to the larger community here in Florida. Next slide. Okay. Another strength that we have one of the best coercion statutes in the country. A number of other legislatures have actually modeled their laws after Florida's laws that look at how is it that people can be coerced into prostitution. So again, not in our human trafficking statute, but rather in our prostitution statute. And Florida recognizes that there's a number of ways that people can be actually induced to engage in what we would call forced prostitution, sex trafficking, but prostitution in general. It could include blackmail, threats to interfere with parental rights. We've seen that as a form of coercion. Exploiting developmental disabilities. We're increasingly seeing cases where it's that developmentally disabled individual that's singled out by a pimp, one of the vulnerabilities that sex traffickers look for. But also exploiting pornographic performances. Florida had law before most other states and actually preceded some of the federal law that later followed, and making sure that pornographic performances, stripping, could be included as forms of sex trafficking and as ways of coercing people into it. And then finally, Florida has said exploiting human needs for food, shelter, safety, or affection. A quite broad-based approach looking at how diverse the forms of coercion are that sex traffickers and pimps use. So again, Florida gets very high marks in these areas. We've had a number of other states duplicate our statutes here. Next slide. Okay, and another strength, Florida in many ways has led the way. We're one of a number of states now that has what's called a safe harbor law. We got ours in 2 stages. Basically back in 2012, the legislature introduced the idea that it should be the dependency track rather than the delinquency track when minors, children, are found to be engaged in commercial sex. It took a number of years for our legislature to reach that, the idea that we do not arrest children for prostitution. Now in 2012, at law enforcement's insistence, they still insisted that they be given the discretion to arrest. Now the law didn't tell them when, if ever, might it be appropriate to arrest a child for prostitution. But that was left open at that point in time. We had an incomplete safe harbor law. In 2016, we revisited that and we clarified that minors will not be arrested for prostitution under any circumstances. So that in a sense, we took that away from law enforcement, but we have a very, very clear line in the sand now that minors are not arrested for prostitution and that we in fact put them into the world of services. To be honest, we're still in the process of identifying what are the best services, how can we provide better services, more comprehensive ones. But this is a baseline law, very important. Next slide. Okay, very important part of Florida law. Florida imposes a solicitation fine of $5,000 on anyone who attempts to purchase commercial sex. Again, not just sex trafficking, anyone who attempts to purchase an act of prostitution can be hit with a $5,000 fine. Why this is important, number one, our Florida legislators said, yeah, that the first $500 of that, it'll pay for drug treatment programs for children that have actually been induced into that world of commercial sex. Many of them struggle with substance abuse issues. So the legislature said, first 500 goes to drug treatment programs. The other 4,500 goes to fund our safe harbor shelters. Again, we currently have about 8 of them here in Florida, 1 just for boys, but very important that that funding from would-be Johns, would-be clients, go to the very children that are being damaged. What this also goes to is, I think, what's been another priority in Florida, addressing demand, addressing the demand side that provides the market for sex trafficking to thrive. So that this, again, a very important segment of our law, both for financially funding victim services, but also for getting at the demand side. Next slide. Okay, there are still gaps, obviously. Every year we revisit the gaps as we learn more about those gaps as well. Right now, labor trafficking, especially of children. DCF has actually been quite a leader in recognizing that because of gaps in our Florida laws, and they have to do with the fact that we have not yet defined well enough what exploitation constitutes, especially as it concerns children who are being labor trafficked. We have a proposed bill that hopefully our legislators will actually take up. There's a great DCF working group right now that's looking just at labor trafficking, and in particular at labor trafficking of children. We also need to do a better job regulation of child sales crews. This is, again, weak statutes that we have that have allowed perpetrators to continue basically pursuing these child sales crews conspiracies. Finally, we need to do more in victim remedies. And I know a number of our survivor experts and caregivers will talk about that today. One of the problems we have, victims still cannot sue their perpetrators in Florida. Again, we've criminalized things, but that we have not gotten to the pocketbooks of everyone that's actually committing trafficking. Until we do, I believe that we won't be able to get at really stopping trafficking. Creating a private right of action, we have that in federal law, but Florida has resisted it. So we very much need to revisit it. Okay, next slide. Okay. Shared Hope International recently issued a 2021 report card on all the states in the country. This year, they employed a new, what they call advanced legislative framework. A little controversial. Florida was given an overall C, but an F in our criminal provisions. As it turns out, according to Shared Hope, we were the only state that passed, and that the other 49 states were given failing grades. Now, I do have to tell you as a professor that if overnight I changed my grading scheme so that only one person passed and the other members of the class all failed, I would be taken to task. And this is a question that has been raised about the most recent Shared Hope International report card. And next slide. It, of course, has noted a number of important things for us to address. It should be noted, though, that many of the criteria of the new Shared Hope report card, they go far beyond child sex trafficking. So they're addressing things like ages in which we actually keep children in foster care. Should we have a law that basically criminalizes entities, businesses that may be somehow affiliated with human trafficking? It goes way beyond the more narrow lane of child sex trafficking. So that, I think, has to be taken into consideration. To be honest, there's not a completely accurate reading of all of our statutes. They miss a number of things, but very importantly, they miss policy and procedures. They've looked at what we kind of call black letter law. They missed a great deal of what we're doing at the statewide level, what DCF has actually been doing, and the policies that we have as a state have pursued. They missed entirely our statewide Human Trafficking Council, which has also been quite innovative. Okay, next slide. Some very, very important things. Again, our legislature annually revisits how it is that we can better combat trafficking. This year, we have once again a number of really, really good bills. I'm not even looking at all of them, but three of them that especially caught my eye as both an advocate who works with victims, but also as a policy person. Senator Diaz's bill, SB 772, limiting victim depositions. This is one that Kathy Hernandez has actually championed for a number of years. And it looks at this idea of deposition by right. Should defense attorneys really have the right to have any kind of long deposition of a child, either a child who's a victim of sex abuse or child sex trafficking, who could be put through a quite traumatizing deposition without the right to an attorney, without the right to an advocate? Again, 44 states have basically prohibited this, as has the federal government. Florida is an outlier state that we still allow this, and this is a really important bill by Senator Diaz that addresses this. And it's a huge gap in our laws in terms of how we care for our victims. A new bill that was just rolled out this week, Representative Toledo, HB 1439, it would make even first-time sex purchasing a felony, still only a misdemeanor. It would ban hourly hotel rates at hotels, again, which is an invitation to sex trafficking. It would also require hotel operators to require IDs at the point when someone comes in to register for occupancy. People cannot slide by anonymously like so many of our sex traffickers do that are using hotels. Was just this week serving as an expert witness in a case where a South Florida hotel had not asked any questions, had allowed people to pay cash, not asked for IDs, so that this meets that gap. Okay, and the third law that I think, the third bill, Senator Garcia's bill, mandating human trafficking training for prospective foster care parents. Again, one of the areas where a lot of our at-risk children are, so that her bill is, I think, a tremendous addition. So again, just kind of a quick walk through our statutes and where we're going, hopefully, in the future here. Thank you all.
Thank you, Terry. That was quite wonderful and informative. I think it makes me have hope and feel positive for where Florida is headed. When you shared your questions with me, and I went into the Shared Hope report card, and I saw that were the only state that passed, I was like, oh my goodness. But with your information, you've given us quite a bit. So I do encourage the audience at this time to please get your questions prepared so that you can direct them to Terry Coonan at the end of the session. You really shared a lot of good information. I was very happy to hear about taking the money from the Johns and the traffickers and using that to provide services for the youth and for the children. I think that's great. A lot of creativity that is involved in policy and decision making, and a lot of truth that needs to be acknowledged. So I'd like to start my first question to Maria Jose. Thank you, Terry, and please stand by. I'd like to begin my first question to Maria Jose. Maria, please give us some background about VIDA and the work that you do.
Good morning, everyone in the state of Florida. And also I noticed that we have people participating from Chicago, from Alabama, from Indiana. So welcome, everyone. Very happy to be here. This is the second year that we get together via Zoom. So it's a new experience for me. Learning from all of you on how to do this better. VIDA is a nonprofit agency that we formed in 2011. 5 attorneys that have been working on these issues for, well, the late 90s, since the late 90s and early 2000s. And we are dedicating all our resources to provide free legal assistance in the immigration area to survivors of human trafficking, domestic violence, sexual violence, child abuse, and other gender-based egregious crimes, right? So we began the work individually as attorneys in the area of gender-based violence, mostly because the immigration law have protections for victims of domestic violence. But at the same time, we encounter victims of human trafficking, which they were not called like that at the time. This is in 1996, 1997. And we didn't have tools within the immigration system to assist them. And so our clients became witnesses in the Capitol, talking to senators, talking to representatives, and they participated in the creation of the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act.
Very good. Wonderful. So tell us a little bit about some of the legal remedies that are available to immigrants who are human trafficking victims.
So looking at the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act of 2000, we put our heads together, nonprofit agencies that were working with survivors of trafficking and law enforcement. And at the time was the federal law enforcement. We were working with Department of Justice, Department of Labor, and other agencies, governmental agencies. And what we realized is that at the time, the people that were identified as victims of trafficking were mainly non-citizens, individuals that were in this country either on temporary visas, worker visas, or they have come crossing the border. They were recruited in their countries of origin to come and work in the United States, individuals from Mexico, from China, from India, from all the countries in Central America. And yes, mainly, and this is a phenomena that has happened throughout the years where at the beginning, mostly men were the individuals migrating, but then during the 2000s and so forth, women and young girls began migrating to support their families in the countries, and they were escaping violence, serious violence. And so we looked at how can we help them stay in this country legally if they were collaborating with law enforcement in the prosecution, the investigation of the crimes committed against them. And so mainly we created a T visa, which is specifically created for victims of human trafficking, U visa that addresses more than 30 crimes that are a lot of them related to human trafficking and domestic violence, and also temporary remedy that you're gonna hear from Katina later, and she can explain more about it. Continued presence. So continued presence and temporary relief when we identify a victim, and I know many of you are advocates and therapists, and you're working with individuals that may not have been identified yet as victims of human trafficking. Once the person is identified as potential victim of human trafficking, we can start a process communicating with HSI from ICE, the Homeland Security Investigation Unit of the Department of Homeland Security, or ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, to start developing a process where they can stay here in the country legally. They can work. It's a matter of stabilizing the victim so they can be a good witness and participatory witness, and also to get them access to why are they here, right? Why are they in the United States? They are working and they need to work legally. And also if they cannot work legally or they cannot work because of the trauma that they suffer, they can access certain relief available under the Health and Human Services resources available for victims of human trafficking.
Very good. And quickly, thank you, Maria Jose. And very quickly, can you tell me what some of those benefits are, or what some of that relief entails?
Okay, so for the T visa, we need to demonstrate that the individual is a victim of severe form of trafficking, and that's a legal definition. It's not that one person is going to be suffering more or less as a victim of trafficking. It's just what the immigration law use as the legal terminology. So severe victim of trafficking is someone that has been forced, defrauded, through it's through force or coercion. And I am very happy that Terry gave us the definition of coercion in one particular area, specifically is for exploitation of in the area of commercial sex. But that definition of coercion is critical. When we talk about human trafficking, we talk about the exploitation of the human life, forcing them to work against their will, which in the past was through mainly the use of force or the threat of force. But the TVPA, the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act, recognizes that the traffickers are using coercion mainly, psychological, economical, emotional coercion to keep people working against their will. So once we have that demonstrated, we need to show that the person is in the country on account of that trafficking. So the person, it doesn't have to be that the person was brought into the United States just to be a slave, just to be trafficked, but that the person was recruited, induced. And that's another word that you're going to hear to mention a lot, the inducement into the work against their will, and how they convince them. The trafficker convinced the individual to do this, and they find themselves unable to leave. And also the person needs to demonstrate that they suffer severe harm, and if they are deported. So it's I will need a whole day to give you all the details, but in general, what I want to, I think the main message that I want to mention is that with any of this immigration relief available, you as an advocate or as a therapist or someone that is working as a case manager need to know that they exist, that if the person that you're working with, child, adult, men, women, they come from another country and their immigration status is unstable, that you need to connect with that responsible immigration attorney that knows about the type of remedies. So locally, you can connect with the Association of Immigration Lawyers, that you're local, so you can identify people that are doing this work. Also through your task force, in general, people that are immigration attorneys that are providing services to victims of trafficking are connected to the local task force against human trafficking. So you have the T visa mainly, U visa, and then there's, because many of you are working with children, the special immigrant juvenile status. That's very important. It's a much faster way to get to being a lawful permanent resident. And there's other technicalities that apply to that. But again, my message is please contact an experienced immigration attorney in the area of victimization.
Excellent. Thank you, Maria Jose. You are a fountain of knowledge, truly, and I appreciate your participation. I'm going to take a moment and I'm going to pivot a little, and I'd like to speak with Katina Hernandez. She's a special agent from Homeland Security, and I'll wait till she's on camera here for a moment. There you go. Good morning, Katina.
Good morning.
Okay. So tell us and tell the audience a little bit about what does human trafficking look like here in Miami? So we're local Miami-Dade County. What does it look like here in Miami for a law enforcement person such as yourself?
Okay, so mainly there's many different forms of trafficking, but mainly what we're seeing is, with tourism, nightclubs, day clubs, day parties, events such as golf tournaments, sports events, even Art Basel. And mainly what it is that these women and men will come into the country, or they will be either recruited while they're in their country online, or they will come in to visit. And while they're here, they'll be recruited. And for example, someone will approach them telling them they're so beautiful, they look like models, and they could be a model, and they'll go that route and take pictures, and they could then be coerced into going out with a group of girls and a group of guys, and they can eventually, what will happen is they'll be drugged, and they'll find themselves in a situation that they are not agreeing in. They're now scared. They're not even understanding or realizing that they're being trafficked most of the time until we recover them or until they escaped and seek help. And they'll be in a situation where they're forced to work, mainly sex, which sex is also labor and sex trafficking. And they are using drugs and being treated horrifically. And as Maria Jose said, that's also psychological. They'll use their immigration status against them. They will use the fact that they will, their family members, they will report it to, put them on social media to exploit them, to show the world, whether they're pictures of, nude pictures or pictures that they don't really want exposed. But there's so many different aspects, but that's like the main aspect of sex trafficking. So I can go into labor trafficking too.
Okay. I would like you to touch upon that, but I wanted to ask you, what are some of the greatest challenges that you all face, that law enforcement faces? Is it the identification? Is it what is it?
So the biggest challenge, honestly, is the fact that the victim does not even understand that they are a victim. So once they've experienced this traumatic event, whether it's the first time or if it's something that's ongoing for them, once they've gone through this traumatic situation, they normally don't even want to speak about it again right away, or they don't want to follow through with an investigation because they don't want to face their trafficker, or they don't want someone in their family to get hurt or someone back in their country to get hurt. We do still provide services and help them as long as they want us to help them. We don't have to move forward with an investigation. We like to, only so that trafficker will not continue to offend others and recruit others the way they did to that person. What we do find is later on, whether it's 4 or 5 years later, unfortunately, another victim comes up, and then we can go back to the survivor now that we encountered 4 or 5 years ago and have them as a supporting witness to make the case stronger. So it is a lengthy process and it is extremely challenging, but we do find the rewards within time.
Thank you, Katina. Thank you for sharing. And you know, as I'm listening to you, and I've heard this a lot, and I've even facilitated in the sense of teaching at Christie House, the fact that a lot of times those with a lived experience don't recognize that they have been trafficked. And so for me, it goes to show the importance of the work that the service providers, the officers, those individuals that touch that person, that child, that individual, you know, immediately after the event has happened, and even afterwards, the importance of the sensitivity, the trauma-informed training, and just to see beyond. So thank you. Thanks for sharing that. I'm going to pivot once again and change it. My next question is for Natalie. Good morning, Natalie. You need please unmute yourself.
Good morning again. Thank you, Deborah, for having me.
Thank you for being here. Thank you. So Natalie is with the Guardian Ad Litem, and of course they are part of our MDT partners. And so I want to speak to you, or I want to ask you, Natalie, a little bit about the role of the Guardian Ad Litem program in preventing or working against human trafficking of minors.
The Guardian Ad Litem program is a court-appointed program. That's the program here in Florida. I see we have some folks from around the country, and other states is referred to as CASA. But the idea is to have an independent agency representing the best interest of children in dependency court. And I see a lot of case managers and other folks who are familiar with dependency. So I'll just briefly explain for those who may not be familiar. That is the court system that takes care of the cases when a child has to be, or children have to be removed from their parents because of abuse, abandonment, and neglect. And one of the reasons that the Florida legislature recognizes commercial sexual exploitation and human trafficking as one of the reasons for dependency, for having a child be dependent on the state from protection, for protection from abuse, abandonment, or neglect. And that could be that could come about because the child was recruited, unfortunately, when they were already in foster care, or it can come about because they were already being trafficked and then came into the dependency system because their parents or legal guardians were not currently known or capable of providing the necessary and appropriate provision and care that they needed to be protected from the exploitation. So once that case is open, the Guardian program works, it's a team, the Guardian Ad Litem attorney like myself, with either a trained Guardian Ad Litem volunteer or a trained staff Guardian Ad Litem trained in human trafficking to help represent what is in the best interest of this child or children in that court case. And we work together with other people from that child's team, such as the case managers. And I see several case managers from our Grace Court team here today. And we also work together with the therapists and with the counselors, the life coaches, the child advocates from Project Gold. And we determine what is in the child's best interest and represent that to the court. We also share with the court the child's wishes, but our role, I should say, is to represent what is in the child's best interest, even if that is not what the child wishes. And most often, not really most often, but it does happen where a child wants something that is not in their best interest.
Okay, thanks for sharing. I want to ask you a little bit, I want to ask you the following question in regards to social media. And when you had communicated with me before, we talked a little bit about that and about elopement. So how have you found that social media has both helped and hindered the work that you all do as it relates to the youth?
Well, it's hurt our work in the sense that, and we heard this from Professor Terry earlier, it has increased, online recruitment of children has increased, and dating apps have increased. So as this increase in use of social media, it has made it through new apps and increased time online. It's made it easier for children to have access to traffickers. and for traffickers to have access to the children, and for Johns and Janes to connect with minors as well. So we have seen, and I've seen this on my caseload, an increased use of social media, both by the children and as affecting their exploitation. There's constantly new apps that are coming, they're being developed. Backpage closed, but there are other dating apps, there are other dating websites and escort services, websites that our children unfortunately get linked to through having access to social media. We've seen the increased use of Uber and Lyft and those types of services. So our foster children are using these services just like the rest of us, but they're using them to meet with their Janes or Johns or their exploiters, unfortunately. And the practice now has become not just making sure that children are not physically in the situations where they were recruited from previously. The flea market was a very big red flag for us, and where a lot of children were exploited and recruited from. But now even a child can be recruited from their foster home or from school by having access to Johns, Janes, exploiters through social media. So we try to address that by limiting and prohibiting their uses of social media, their access to phones. And really the phone is just when it's the social media that they have access to through the phone, not so much the phone itself. And our children today don't want just a phone that dials numbers, of course. They want the smartphones because they want access to those apps. You asked also, how has that helped?
Yes.
And so despite our best efforts, we try to limit the child's youth access to social media, determining, because we don't not only want them to have access to exploiters, but it also may be triggering for them. And most of our children, as we heard about the impact of trauma because of the trafficking, they are still learning about their trauma, about the fact that they were trafficked, and how to respond to that in a healthy way. Many, as they're unfortunately have developed many maladaptive behaviors. We've heard also earlier about substance abuse. That's just one way. And if they're triggered, they're going to go back to what is comfortable, a way that they get their needs met. So the Guardian Litem program, I forgot to mention earlier, we try to work with our team members to make sure that all the child's needs are being met. So they're not looking for those needs to be met by the trafficker, whether that's increased tutoring or clothing or some community time if it's safe for them. We want to support them, and we do that by advocating with our team members, but also advocating in court for these needs that the children have. Now, I haven't quite answered the question, so helping. So despite our best efforts to try to limit children from having social media, they still find a way to do it, whether it's using their classmate's phone or getting a phone from their trafficker or from a parent who may not be as on board with the team's recommendations and plan. When these children leave their foster homes, and you mentioned elopement, so when they leave their foster homes without permission, and that could be overnight or that could be for months at a time, they're taking these phones with them. So it's helping us because it's giving us a lifeline to the children, even when they're on elopement. And I've had several children who are in elopement, but still text or use social media to keep in contact with case managers, with guardian ad litems, with their attorney ad litems, or with their therapists and life coaches. So we're able to kind of keep track of how the child is doing. And we've been able to also incentivize children to come back into care by having that contact with the cell phone that they weren't supposed to have, but they still had while they were on elopement. It's also allowed, if I could just
go ahead.
Allowed them to participate in court hearings. So we've had children who've been on elopement, but have participated because our court hearings are virtual, participated in the Zoom hearings. And so we're able to have eyes on the child, even though the child's not in their foster home, and it allows us contact. So there's both the good side and the bad side in this increase of technology. Thank you.
Right. Yes, you're very welcome, Natalie, and thank you. That's so so important to consider, and I think that we all know that we all love the internet and the information that we have, but we also know that we have a lot of responsibility. So I need to switch gears. So we are now going to begin to receive questions from the audience, and I think the questions have already come in. And now Jess is going to take it away, and she's going to pull those questions and direct them to you, all the panelists.
Yes, hello everyone. So we have quite a few questions from the audience, and we're just going through the filter. But the first one, Dr. Coonan, if you would not mind addressing. For those who cannot see the question, it was someone who shared a concern in a question. During so many of these meetings, I have heard the word prostitution used many times to describe child sex trafficking. As a survivor of child sex trafficking and former trauma counselor for child survivors, there was no consent or choice, and never given anything but threats against their lives, lives of their family and friends if they did not comply. And whether they did or not, the threats were real and included assault, torture, disappearance, and murder. This is more of a comment and question to really create space for how damaging the language can be to refer to them as prostitutes. If Dr. Coonan, you wouldn't mind addressing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And thank you, Elizabeth, for that question and that concern. It's key. The language that we use is so crucial in terms of how we combat trafficking. Now, the criminal statute is still the offense of prostitution. In this case, prostitution committed against a child. We would no longer say child prostitute. 20 years ago, we heard that. Now we would say prostituted child. That is something that is done to that child. And as Elizabeth notes in her great comment, it's nothing that a child consents to. They don't choose it. They can't be blamed for it. It's a crime committed against them. So the language is very, very clear. The criminal offense under Florida and federal law is still called prostitution or sex trafficking, but we're increasingly clear, and this is the result of great survivor advocates, to be quite honest, that they help us tremendously when it comes to the language that we use and helping us move beyond older, more obsolete understandings of these crimes. So no, that is very much a part of our approach here in Florida now. We would never talk about a child prostitute, but thank you for raising that. And it's a reminder. And for me, one of the great promising practices is the fact that survivor mentors, survivor advocates are always at the table now, that their voices are so crucial and their expertise is so unerring when it comes to knowing just how horrific this crime is. So yeah, thank you for that question. And it's a great reminder that, yeah, as we move forward, the language we use equally important to the laws that we pass.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. And even in our third panel, our third session today, we will touch on survivor-led, the importance of survivor-led leadership in a lot of these initiatives and a lot of the efforts that are taking place. And Dr. Coonan, since we do have you, there is a question in regards to the report card. So this question is, I understand that Florida was the only state that passed because there was some sort of special way that they were graded. I've also heard loud and clear that you believe that they missed some very important positive things Florida has already implemented, but how can states like Texas compare their scores on the report card? This person is really just wondering exactly how to share the results of the scorecard with coalitions and how to move forward with it in Texas.
Well, I think, and Texas faces the same challenge that Florida does, in that we absolutely want to address a number of the concerns that Shared Hope International raises. Their grading system, which again, as a professor, I would be called to task if I changed my grading system overnight and only one student passed out of the entire class. The grading system is perhaps less relevant. I think it is important to look at what are the points that they raise. They raise some good points, but they're not necessarily universally true. They miss, for instance, they miss our $5,000 solicitation fine. Okay, I mean, that was just not part of their analysis at all. A number of their recommendations go far beyond child sex trafficking. So again, yeah, we look at these, where appropriate and where, again, Florida would find them to be helpful. I would hope that Texas and other states would do the same. I think the point being, though, that don't get lost over the grade, but that think about what's being asked of states. And Shared Hope International has done tremendous work over the years, but in employing what they call, and they acknowledge that their new advanced legislative framework, it goes beyond the lane of child sex trafficking. So again, we have to deal with that accordingly. It is a great conversation starter for policy people, for legislators, so it can be useful there.
Thank you, Dr. Coonan. Now I have a few questions for Ms. Katina. The first one is in regards to T-visa. Is the victim of HT required to participate in prosecuting their trafficker in order to obtain their visa? And if they do not participate, will they be deported for not participating?
Okay, so that's a really good question, and it's very important to understand that. No, okay, I want to get this out so that people can understand. Now, they have to cooperate, or we must be able to corroborate the information that they gave us. However, an investigation does not need to go forward or prosecuted. So for example, I was able to assist the victim that we encountered, who she experienced something called Stockholm syndrome. I'm not sure if that's a little premature. It's where she realized that her trafficker was actually helping her, or she thought that her trafficker was actually helping her, because in her country, she was in a worse living situation. And in this country, she was sleeping on a couch instead of a floor in her country. So anyway, we were not able to go forward with the prosecution. However, we were able to move forward and fill out the paperwork for her, and she did obtain a T visa. So for a T visa, a prosecution is not necessary. However, cooperation from the victim/survivor is necessary. And either way, they will not get deported. We are not deporting victims, people who are have come forward or not, that we identify as a victim. So no, they will not get deported. And no, the prosecution does not have to go forward. However, it is very helpful if they give us information on the trafficker, and we can actually corroborate that information.
Okay. Now, is there an age limit that traffickers, in your experience, typically look for?
An age limit?
Yes. And if you could share some signs that that a child is typically trafficked.
It depends on the trafficker. It depends on the organization. So there are traffickers. It's the supply demand. So if they have, let's say, an organization where their clients are looking for minors, there are organizations that run specifically for minors, or there may be older women who just look younger. There's organizations that specifically recruit for boys. There's organizations that specifically recruit for men. It just depends on who their clientele are. And the biggest thing that we have to understand is vulnerability. The vulnerability is what these traffickers look for. Either children in foster care, adults who have been, seem to have been either in domestic violence or past history of sex abuse. They will go in and befriend these alleged, the victims, survivors. I hate to call them victims because I don't like that to be attached. They will go in and befriend the survivors and pretend that either they're going to be their boyfriends or a friend, or lure them into modeling and try to find out information on them. And then they'll use that information against them, like, oh, where's your family? Where's your family from? How many sisters do you have? Do you have children? What do you like to do? What do you want to be when you grow up? Things like that. And then they'll use that against them. And what they'll do is they'll find their vulnerabilities. As let's say somebody wants to be a singer, or somebody wants to be an actress. They'll come out and say, oh, I can get you this, and I can help you get into singing. But before that, let's make some money to go into a studio and work at the strip club for me. And then, oh, maybe you'll have to have sex with a couple guys and you'll make some more money. So it'll go step by step. It just all depends on how manipulative these offenders and traffickers are and how vulnerable the victim survivors are. And what was the other? There was another.
The other question was about like different signs that a child is being trafficked.
So signs for children could be, depending on who's looking for the signs. If it's a friend of theirs, you would, I always say, you know, when I go to high schools and kids ask me, how would I know? Well, if your friend is either missing school, if your friend is coming to school with expensive clothing or shoes or phones that they haven't come with, or they have extra cash. For a parent, I would say, you know, they're, you know, really check on your child, really make sure, you know, the behavior, the school patterns, their grades. Sometimes kids can still keep up their grades and be in a difficult situation, but just check on them, make sure they're there in the middle of the night, because sometimes they sneak out and they'll go work and they'll be in the bed and they'll be in their home in the morning. Check on the Instagram accounts. They always have more than one account. Check all their friends, know who their friends are, track their phones, go through their phones. You pay that bill, you go through that phone, even if you don't pay that bill. I've had parents follow their children, hire private investigators, whatever it takes, you know, to be able to prevent this, because I've been in a situation where a mom called me and we literally prevented her from being trafficked from a guy within like 2 days. It was like so fast. And that's what it takes. Like the love from a parent, the self-love, the stability of the home, how the parent will fight for their kid. And there's a very crucial moment where you have to just love on that child. Hey, let's go to a play, let's go shopping. Like just give them that time, because what they'll see is that this child is going in a corner, texting or constantly texting, or mom, I'll be right back. They'll disappear. You know, they'll start, you know, doing and acting in a way that it's not your child. And those are the very crucial moments that you need to be on top of your child. We're so busy working and we're so busy in our lives. We really, really, really need to think and focus how we could lose our children in a matter of hours.
Okay, thank you for that. So there's I know we want to go along with time. Just to answer one of the questions here, someone did ask about how to go about having just photos and videos and things removed from the internet, in addition to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Anyone can answer if there's any other resources to have some of those pictures and videos scrubbed.
I don't know if anybody wants to answer that. That would have to be, I know our cyber department, our cyber group basically says there's not really a way to delete. Once it's out into the internet, it's out there. I know NECMEC does have a way, and then there's different, I mean, it just depends on what you put in. Like there's something I heard, Patreon. If you're using Patreon now, that's not going to be permanent, but a lot of the kids and the people who are using the internet, they don't really know. So I don't have a for sure answer, but from what I've heard from our cyber team is that it's very, very difficult to remove images from the internet once they're out there.
Okay, and then the last question, Ms. Maria or Natalie can answer, whichever one, which is the language, because you guys mentioned how sometimes they don't know if their survivor is being recovered. They don't know that they're actually being trafficked. What is some of the languages language or the process in which you kind of explain to them what's going on? Does it typically happen right when they're rescued at the place, or is that something that happens afterwards for them to kind of understand what happened to them?
Do you want me to answer?
Yes, anyone can answer.
I can answer it from the perspective of an attorney that gets a referral for someone that already has been identified as a non-citizen. So we perhaps receive a referral of a child that has been sexually abused by a family member. And or it could be a referral because there's domestic violence in the household, and this child is part of this household. And I'm going to concentrate on children because that's what mainly the questions are for. And so under 18. And so for us is, you know, we sit down with them, and depending on the age, sometimes the parents are, or the caregiver is with us, sometimes they're on their own. And my responsibility as an attorney is to provide the assistance that that child, that person requires from me. So I owe my services to that person. And we work in conjunction with guardian ad litem to help us through this process, because sometimes these children tell me, I want to go back home. Home means their country of origin, where they probably escape abuse. So it's very complicated to get to that. So we have these conversations with them about life in general. So we want to put them in, you know, and again, I'm listening to what everybody's saying, and it's, you know, look at the needs of that child, and the needs of that child they have to be addressed right there and then. Otherwise, you're going to lose them. And so the network of organizations that are working together to help this child. We had a case of a 17-year-old that was sexually exploited. And she, at one point, she had 5 different attorneys. So imagine all these people, if they're not connected, what is the message that they're sending that child? So what we want is the child to feel comfortable, to trust us, because they're interviewing us. If they have been in the streets and they have been mistreated and forced and exposed to torture and other forms of abuse, they're not going to trust us. They are going to distrust every adult in their life. So we really see the interview as them interviewing us to make sure that they can trust us. So it could be that we spend several interviews without even talking about immigration, without even talking about what is trafficking or anything like that. It's just about developing trust. And many of you are experts on that are working with children for many years. These are not easy cases. I think that because we work in community, that's when we get, you know, if one child, like if a child from Project Gold feels comfortable at Project Gold, and Project Gold says VIDA is going to help you with your immigration case, there's already a jump over one of the barriers of that trust development. So for us, the main thing is to listen with an open mind, non-judgmental, offering the services and saying, we're here for you. And if you decide to not take them, think that in the moment that you need us, we're going to be here for you. And that's mainly how we get to explain to them that what is happening to them is not normal. It's not normal. But we need to learn about who they are, their whole life. So then that conversation can happen.
And in the dependency cases as well, it is a conversation, and I think we may hear about this from Nathan later. I know I've heard in his trainings about it's not using that terminology, but explaining, did you receive something in return for what happened? Did you have it? So it's explaining the kind of the definition and not using the terminology. But I think a lot of that realization is really going to come out, not so much in the interviews right after or in the moment when a child is removed, or the initial interviews with whether it's a guardian ad litem or the case manager or the child protective investigator, but it's really going to come in, happen during trauma-informed individual therapy, where that therapist is working through the child's trauma narrative to realize this was not normal, like we heard Maria Jose mention, this what that happened, and coming to that realization in a therapeutic setting. I know we have a lot of therapists as well here, but that may be more of that setting where that realization takes place.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. So now we're going to get into our second session, but we want to thank you all so much for sharing everything in our first session. We have learned so much. For those of you who have asked questions, we are doing our best to answer them for you now, those that were not answered live, in addition to a few of them that we're deferring for the next session because there was someone on that panel to better answer that question for you. So we thank you again for your time. You're more than welcome to stay on and interact with any of the people as well, or any of the questions that you see come up. And we're going to go right into our next session.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Sybil, if you could pull up, perfect, thank you. So this, if you want to take a moment, this information will be sent out in the email that you use to register, excuse me, that you use to register for the training. And once you complete the post survey at the end, it would automatically generate a completion of this session, in addition to a copy of the slides and the contact information for every single panelist that we've had for every session. Next slide. So as we get into our session, our second session, providing services for all trafficking survivors. Here you're going to hear from several panelists on just different intersectionalities and their respective areas of expertise as it comes to human trafficking in their different areas. So today on the panel, we have Francesco Duberli, who is the Executive Director of Survivors Pathway. We have Mr. Nathan Earl, who is the Principal of Giant Slayers Communication, and Ms. Jamaro Johnson, excuse me, Director of Community Outreach and the Human Trafficking Coordinator for the Broward State Attorney's Office. So we thank you all for being with us today, and go ahead and take it away, Mr. Earl.
Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. Christy House, thank you for continuing to bring the community together. It really is an honor to be working alongside the panelists here and everyone in the room, especially with, it's a pleasure, it's a treat to be working next to, or with Jamaro and Francesco. So we have, let me pull up these slides. Next slide. Paul Farmer's belief that the idea that some lives matter less is the root of all that is wrong in the world undergirds, really sustains the very existence of human trafficking, of this form of crime, of this form of violence. It always has. The images here do not represent victims nor survivors, and they certainly don't represent, are not the faces of human trafficking, but a reminder of the rich diversity of our community, a reminder of humanity, of potential, of our future leaders, of our children, of our community. And every one of these identities represented here deserve equitable opportunities to rise above any adversity that they may experience. Since the first passing of the TVPA, and certainly since the passing of the Mann Act in 1910, we have made great strides in some areas, but we have to be honest and accept that we've missed the mark in some areas. Some groups have been identified and empowered, but to the detriment of other high-risk groups. In particular, within the context of today's conversation, I'm speaking about Black, Hispanic, and those native to America, those identifying along the LGBTQI2S spectrum or transgender, bisexual, gay, lesbian, two-spirit, and those identifying as non-binary, boys and men, and foreign-born individuals. These groups were actually identified by the Office on Trafficking in Persons as high-risk groups. So with that said, we have to ask ourselves if the movement as a whole, and not targeting any one individual, but as the movement as a whole, have we assigned varying values to the lives and to the trauma experienced by different groups of people, by different groups and of people? And if that isn't the case, why then would there be the need to remind the community that these groups continue to be overlooked or willfully neglected? Wouldn't there be a lot more services in the community for underserved groups? And as just one example, labor trafficking survivors and those who have been forced to provide unfree labor have received woefully less attention and resources than sex trafficking survivors across the country since before the passing of the TVPA. Jamaro, Francesco, and I will spend the next hour advocating for more equitable prevention and survivor support for underserved groups. To be clear, this is not about what certain data or biased data tells us about who is being trafficked more. This is about ensuring our community's response to human trafficking meets the needs of all people, regardless of gender identity, citizenship status, race, or other differences. Next slide, please.
Look at me. Do you see me as I am, or what society has said I am? See me as I am, as a human being with humanity, with mothers, fathers, daughters, sons, as loving husbands, with feelings, with dreams. We are told that we can be the change we want to see. But if you don't see me, then how can the change be? If you face me, maybe you will see me. And if you see me, you might be able to help me. Listen to me. Help me tackle the trauma. Provide me with a support system. Create a safe space for me to rise, to become the noble being I was meant to be.
The Supporting Male Survivors of Violence demonstration initiative was a
Next slide, please. So, violence against boys and men or all male youth is a global pandemic of violence affecting this population across the planet. We see this from sexual assault as war tactics. We see it intimate partner violence, domestic violence, gang violence. Those identifying in male are or experience various forms of violence. And by and large, we are not talking about it yet as much as we should. Human trafficking doesn't happen in a vacuum. We know that it many times occurs along a continuum of other related forms of violence. So within that context, before I think when we're developing our response, if we're coming together around the table, okay, how did we miss the mark? Where did we miss the mark? What seems to be the barriers? Why aren't there more services for this population? I think we really have to take an honest look and kind of pivot and look at this through a public health lens. We can do that by referring to the ecological framework. And so what I think we as a group have the most opportunity to make an impact are really looking at the societal and the community level risk factors that exist that prevent disclosure and prevent equitable response. So I've listed several here. There are many, and then I will unpack a little more of this on another slide. The ones highlighted here, I'll speak to more within this presentation. And it's just really the lack of male inclusion. And so someone had mentioned language. We know that there are criminal justice responses that exclude males, whether it's because of resources or neglect. The fact remains that they don't exist. When we're looking at research, many times in prevalence research instruments, we've used the word pimp. All of the pronouns are she and her. Well, we have to realize that many of this population of boys, men, male identifying, they weren't trafficked by the pimp. They were trafficked by a mom, a mama, a man, a woman. And so when we're using that language, we're going to miss that capturing the experiences of that population. The same when it goes to our trainings in the community or with PSA messaging. You know, I would invite you to look at your training and literally count the female pronouns that you use compared to other pronouns. This approach helps to sustain these misconceptions that this population isn't infected. In federal and state definitions of trafficking, as well as screening protocols, we need to include the terms made to penetrate and unwanted sexual advance. These two terms have been shown to increase victim identification by 10% within the Florida juvenile justice system. Another risk factor or other risk factors are honestly just it's not been a priority. So there's a lower priority and conscious neglect, whether that's from racism, gender bias or misandry, homophobia, transphobia, and a lack of knowledge, whether that's through research, the frequency of occurrence, nuanced risks and vulnerabilities for this population, the dynamics of the models or channels for solicitation specific or more often used or utilized to exploit boys and men, and misconceptions around sexual orientation, gender identity, and male victimization. This continues to be a misconception that is in the community. I'll speak to it a little more within one of the research studies, but just so we're on the same page, the majority of male victims will not identify as LGBTQI, gay, or bisexual. The research that I've seen, and I make it a point to be immersed in as much as I can, it varies by region, it varies by community, it varies by the design of the research instrument. We know that LGBTQI survivors are disproportionately represented within the homeless continuum, but that doesn't necessarily mean that by numbers there are more. And so that's important when we're developing our responses, that we have needs, we have linkages, and we have responses, not just for those identifying as LGBTQI2S, but also those that identify as a man or a boy. Boys and young men of color under the gender spectrum, that male gender spectrum, have nuanced needs aside from LGBTQI. They may not identify as gay or bisexual. And so the service responses that we create and mobilize needs to keep that in mind. It really has nothing to do with the quality of care of the provider. It has everything to do with survivor-centered trauma-informed care. And we know that a primary principle of trauma-informed care is safety. And so we have to ask ourselves, would a Black male youth feel comfortable being referred to a provider that has historically been discriminatory to that population in the community? Alternatively, would a trans youth of color be comfortable sent or referred to a faith-based organization that may require them to undergo or attend religious screenings when that child has been kicked out of their home because of their gender expression? And alternatively, would a heterosexual male be comfortable or feel safe being referred to an LGBTQI organization where people there present as many of the ones that have exploited them? So again, it's about resources, it's about that cultural humility and having safe, appropriate referrals for the population. Initiated in 1994 and supported by 5 program project grants from the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. This was co-funded by 23 other federal agencies and foundations. AdHealth is the largest, most comprehensive longitudinal survey of adolescents ever taken. Wave 1 took place between 1994 and 95, during which more than 90,000 students from 145 middle, junior, and high schools completed a 45-minute questionnaire. Another 20,000 completed at-home interviews. The findings from this particular study, the QR code will take you to the reference or to the citation, the source. This was longitudinal sample, a nationally representative sample, grades 7 through 12. 3.5% of the adolescents who participated in this study report or self-disclosed that they had exchanged sex for drugs or money. So given the legal definition, this would have been trafficking if they was a minor. Of this sample, or of this group, 67.9% of those identifying or disclosing that they had exchanged sex for drugs, survival sex, or trafficked identified as adolescent boys. Other significant findings are that the population were more likely to have run away from home, used a wide range of substances, including those that were injected, had anal intercourse, experienced sexual coercion, reported direct depression, and had an STI, HIV diagnosis. Next slide. So initially, when I started the conversation, I invited us to look at this through the lens of a public health approach. And what that does is it moves us away, helps moves us away from the criminal solely or strictly a criminal justice response of, the victim and the buyer, the victim and the perpetrator, who's a perfect victim. This isn't what we're seeing. And it allows us to go upstream, and it allows us to really look at the risks associated with the exploitation of various populations. And what's important here is that when we use this approach, we are able to not only identify risks associated at 4 different levels, but also the resilience factors, the promotive factors that can buffer those risks. It's also really important to gain a thorough understanding of how this happens to this population and how it's sustained, is to realize that the risks that boys and men experience in each sphere do not happen in vacuums, do not happen in silos. I would say the effects of societal gaps and risks trickle down to the community, exacerbate the risk at the family level, and then incredibly exacerbate the risks at the individual level. So when we're creating our responses, one single program in a community can have so much success if the systems that it's operating in is broken or is not equipped to prevent the trafficking of boys and male identifying individuals. Next slide, please. So it has been well documented that adverse child experiences are a driving factor associated with entry into child exploitation, whether that's labor and or sex trafficking. Typically, or there are 3 domains, from physical, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, to neglect, and then household dysfunction. And so here's what I'd like you to do, or invite you to do, is if you're having a problem, so we've addressed one of those, the risk is just the lack of frequency of occurrence. And I can send you today, if you ask, no less than 20 responsibly researched articles that will support the significant frequency of occurrence of male exploitation. There are those still that say, okay, I hear you and I see this, but we're not seeing that in my community. I just don't understand how this population can be exploited. I'll put a pin in that for just 1 second and mention that labor exploitation and labor trafficking as a whole has lacked the attention in general compared to sex trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation. Where I think we still get it twisted, though, where people still get it sticky, is when we're talking about sexual exploitation of boys and men. So I'm going to spend a little more time addressing that. And it's not to marginalize labor trafficking survivors, but again, to address one of these societal level risks around sexual harm against boys and men. So if we can go upstream, and we know that these risks are associated or can lead to the trafficking of girls and children in general, then let's look at those those families of origin and choice. Boys are in those same toxic families. They still have the absent parent. They still experience violence, domestic violence, or witness to violence. They're still in these communities with high violence. They have the substance dependent caregiver. They are sexually abused. So does it make sense that even those repeated doses of trauma would not affect a boy just as much as they affect a girl? And would it make sense that there's somehow a different trajectory into later exploitation? To me, it doesn't. I think we have to, knowing this, then we have to check our own biases. And we have to look at the systems to say, hey, the system that I'm operating in, has it been equipped to identify and respond to male exploitation? So I do think there are the adverse child experiences, but I do think it's important, and this is more recent findings. We're building upon what we know, speaking to adverse community environments. And so the societal and the community level risks would be those adverse community environments. The individual and family risks that boys experience would be that individual would fall in that adverse child experiences. So what's important here to realize about underserved populations, boys and young men of color within this context, transgender individuals, those that identify or that are foreign to or native to America, that poverty, that discrimination, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, the lack of opportunity, the exposure to violence in the community further exacerbate the risks and the effects of the toxic stress that these boys experience within the families and at the individual level. And again, that's important when we're developing our response and to really understand how this happens enough to move us to action, is that there are identified risks at all 4 levels that can lead to the exploitation of boys and men or male identifying individuals. Using that same approach, we can also identify promotive and protective factors to buffer against those risks. There are nuances, I believe, within those risks or within that risk specific to boys and men. Fear of diminishing manhood, the homophobia, there's gender bias, there's racism. I believe that boys and young men of color, heterosexual boys and young men of color, are probably the least screened for any form of sexual harm, including sex trafficking. Many times, unfortunately, they're looked upon as the perpetrator. People of transgender experience continue to report higher rates of victimization and marginalization in the communities. There is prejudice against males in the community. There's a lack of attention on and impunity of female buyers. And there's the exclusion or marginalization in prevention and intervention efforts. So while there are commonalities in vulnerability, there are nuanced needs. The nuanced needs are what makes it so important or reinforces that there is not a one-size-fits-all approach. These nuanced needs warrant additional investment to serve this population, to prevent exploitation of this population. So moving forward, based on this, how can we do better? What needs to happen? First of all, we need to take ownership. The human trafficking movement as a whole has an opportunity to do better. I think that's why we're all here. I'm not looking at adversaries here. I'm looking at colleagues, at friends. Many of you are friends. And we're here today to do better so that we continue to make strides moving forward. So we don't have to have this same type of conversation next year. First and foremost, the community, those with influence and power within the human trafficking ecosystem across Miami and abroad need to take ownership. We need to, I'm not saying necessarily fall on our swords, but we need to acknowledge that we've fallen short. We need to acknowledge that there are responses in the community that blatantly discriminate against boys and men and other population, girls and women of color, LGBTQI individuals. And it's not an us versus them. There are approaches, there are evidence-based approaches where we can center the most marginalized populations to create more equitable ecosystems. Collective impact is one that we have started that process in Broward County, and I hope to continue in the years moving forward. There are others, but before that happens, before we're able to develop targeted interventions at the community or the individual or family level, we have to have buy-in of those with influence to say we need to do better. This is how we're going to do it. Make it a priority. Create working groups, create funding opportunities, create survivor board. There are a lot of opportunities to end the marginalization of this population. And finally, before I end with 3 questions on 3 different slides, we talked about male inclusion. And one of the most valuable lessons that I've learned in my lifetime was over the past few years in the racial reckoning. I, as a white cisgender Christian male, I had to reckon with mistakes of those that present as I do in the past. And I think there are many others that have done that. In order for us to do that as a country, we've had to acknowledge the past. We've had to acknowledge that we fell short, and we had to commit to doing better. We had to, and it was more than, so moving forward, it was more than just adding, a picture of a Hispanic person or a Black or brown person on our website, right? Or, hey, let's invite a Black or brown person to our board. There are a lot of words to describe that. Irresponsible is a nice one, right? It's about culture. It's about having people involved in decision-making that represent the needs of the population that you serve. And I would argue that same approach applies to boys and men and other populations. My time here is for boys and men. That it's more than just adding a picture of a boy or a man on your website or your brochure. It's more than having a conversation with the male identifying survivor. If male survivors and males or at-risk males are not identified or represented within your organization, how effective is your response going to be to serve that population? Or are we dragging male survivors in front of your lens and trying to understand that? So moving forward, we need this focus, we need the attention, we need to make this a priority, and we need representation at the board level, management level, and program level, so that we can more effectively serve this population, increase victim identification, increase our samples and research, so that then we can develop targeted interventions for this group. So that's the end of my talk. I'll have 3 questions. If you could advance to the next slide, please. The one previous, and it's just a question. The one previous, please. Are the lives of these children these young people, these humans, more precious, next slide, than these. And so I asked you then, what side of justice will you stand? That concludes my presentation. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nathan, for the presentation. So I'm just going through my notes. Yes, I agree with everyone in the chat that this excellent points being made. So we're just going to get right into the questions because I see them coming in now and I see people messaging me. Yes. So thank you so much for the presentation. So I'm going to kind of change our questions a little bit. I'm going to switch it around because you just brought up something very, very, very important. So I'm going to start first. Okay, so I want to ask about some nuances in the vulnerability as it pertains to males and then those who do not identify as part of the LGBTQIA community.
Sure, I think I would go back to, from a gender-based perspective of the male gender, cisgender, that misspoke, the gender-based perspective, there are commonalities, and we do mention some of those risk factors. LGBTQ or gay, bisexual, or transmasculine are groups with nuance, with different needs based on the homophobia, prejudice, lack of access to culturally competent healthcare, xenophobia. There are the vulnerabilities that many young people experience. The challenge is with the access to care, so access to service provision. And so I would say again that even within, as a member of the LGBTQI community, I will acknowledge that people of trans experience face discrimination even within the gay community. When connecting with care, developing housing responses and gender affirming healthcare, even within the LGBTQI spectrum, there are groups within that have additional needs, that have needs that a trans person may have additional needs for safe housing than as a gay person. And so it's really important that we speak, and I'm looking forward to Francesco, to kind of unpack that more, but it's also under that gender perspective, again, boys and young men of color may face different challenges based on racism, based on prior experience of discrimination, based on their experiences within marginalized communities. And I would say foreign-born individuals additionally face some of those, the challenges at the individual level are exacerbated because of the xenophobia, because of this discrimination and the lack of services and outreach at that community level. Specific to substance dependency, and I think that overlaps with boys and women of color, LGBTQI, those that do not identify as along that spectrum. Substance dependency is a well-documented root cause and associated risk for exploitation of this population. The National Institute for Drug Abuse tells us that males report to the emergency room more often than anyone else for overdoses. They have higher rates of substance dependency. Within the family model of exploitation, many of the boys are trafficked by caregivers and parents who are substance dependent. I would say that, as a person also in recovery, when I'm in 12-step groups or within treatment programs, boys and young men of color have had less access to the treatment programs I had access to because of more financial security or because of insurance that I was able to have. So substance dependency, if we were looking at nuanced vulnerabilities within gender, I think it warrants more attention. Substance dependency, crystal meth within the LGBTQ community is prominent. It is widely associated with sexual exploitation and other forms of harm. And again, we have LGBTQI youth being sent to the streets because of the lack of resources, being rejected and abandoned. And within the underground economy, coping mechanisms are substance dependency, and I think it's part of that culture. And there are more, but I want to be respectful of the time of my colleagues and my co-panelists.
Thank you. Thank you so much. But it's a perfect segue for us to go right into Ms. Jamaro, questions. So you mentioned, Nathan, about just the different marginal groups, and we can't talk about specifically groups without addressing some things that are systemic and things that affect so many other communities. So Jamaro, through your professional experience and working, with those who have a lived experience with human trafficking and sexual exploitation, what disparities or bias have you seen or witnessed with response and services as it relates to race? And what do you suggest, or what can be done to tackle some of the racial biases that are very evident in social services and advocacy? You're still on mute.
Sorry.
Yes.
You would think in the land of Zoom, I would figure it out by now. But thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. And it is an honor to be a panelist with such amazing people. And a lot of these people are my colleagues that I've worked very closely with. So it is indeed an honor. Thank you for that question. And that question that you just asked could be an entire book. It can be an entire problem statement for a thesis. And so in my experience, and I can only speak from my experience only. So in my experience, the answer to your question is absolutely yes, without a shadow of a doubt. Unequivocally, yes, I have seen the disparity from the social services component when it comes to race, when we are trying to service those who have the lived experience of human trafficking. And I've seen it in the respects of this. I've seen social service providers literally treat those with the lived experience where you have a person of color, it is though it was expected that what happened to them simply because of how they look, where they were from, and their quote unquote lifestyle. And I've been in multidisciplinary staffings. I've been in meetings where we are having discussions about specific people who have the lived experience. And I've literally seen responses from service providers, direct care service providers, where we're talking about one group of people, the response has been that of they've been flabbergasted. They were shocked, and how could this happen? And then when we're talking about another group of people, the response is that of, oh well, we kind of expected this, or oh well, yeah, the mom is this, and the dad is that, and the dad's not in the house, and the mom has this, so it's like I've witnessed I've witnessed a disparity in the response. The response for any person, any child in particular, that has a lived experience of human trafficking should be that of horrific, should be that of, oh my God, should be that of urgency for any child, regardless of what they look like, what color their skin is. Not, we're talking about a white child that comes from a community where they have both parents in their home. The response should not be, oh my God, I can't believe this happened. How did that happen? Well, if you're going to give that response to that particular child, when we're talking about the Black child or the brown child or the indigenous child, that response should be the same. Oh my God, how did that happen? What can we do to service this child, to service this family? Not start talking about all of the risk factors that were involved in that family, as opposed to responding with a state of shock. Now, what can we do? First of all, those of you all who are signing up to do this work, those of you all who are signing up to service those with the lived experience, those of you all who are submitting your resumes and your applications to these agencies in the state of Florida, in Broward County, in Dade County, in Broward, in Palm Beach County, I would implore you, first of all, to educate yourself in cultural competency, okay? I would implore you to do the work. It is not the community that you're serving's responsibility to educate you on their culture. It is your responsibility to do the work. It is your responsibility to say, if you're going to put boots on the ground, and it's not about boots on the ground, it's about whose feet are in the boots, right? So if you're applying, are you applying for a job, or are you applying to actually make a difference? Are you applying to actually service? Are you applying to actually help? It is not the responsibility of the community in which you have signed up to serve to educate you on how to be culturally competent. It is not their responsibility. They have enough going on. They don't have time to educate you on how to treat them better, right? So I do believe that every agency that is servicing communities, I believe that it should be a mandated part of their training. Racial equity training, implicit bias training needs to be mandated as part of your onboarding process, as part of your training process, in order to do this job effectively. Because what you think is how you help, right? And we live in the United States of America, where we all understand that this country was built on systemic racism. This country was built on people being raised, being bred, being thought to believe that one group of people count and another group of people don't, right? That's a fact. That's not something that's being made up. And especially in the state of Florida, South Florida specifically, right? I tell people about South Florida. I love South Florida because you know what? I can get whatever I need from any type of culture that I want in South Florida. I can get whatever kind of food I want. I can experience any type of culture I want in South Florida because we are so amazingly diverse here. We have so many different cultures here. Therefore, what happens is that when people are leaving their countries, when people are leaving their homes to come to this state, they're not leaving their culture in their country, they're bringing their culture here, right? Yes. And if you're signing up with a social service agency to service a community, right? It is your obligation to educate yourself on the culture within that community. Because if you don't, what you end up doing is you end up helping wrong. And when you help wrong, you re-traumatize. And when you help wrong, what you do is you also perpetuate the stereotypes about social service agencies, right? And so in order for us to continue to do the work from a genuine standpoint, we need to make sure that we are requiring those who have signed up to help to do the work, to do the cultural work, so that when they're going into a house where things are going on that we have absolutely no idea, or we can't even fathom going on in our home, but we get it, and we don't judge, and we don't prejudge, and we don't help wrong. So we need to do the work culturally. You have to. You can't service correctly without doing the cultural work.
And I'll take that moment to just thank you. You brought up some amazing points, and I'll take that moment to shout out a few organizations: Hope for Tomorrow, Guiding Light Outreach, a few of them who one of their things is exactly what you say. Their mission is to educate on language. So as you start to get into the Black community, they might not hear the term human trafficking, as it's even a new term even for most people now. Before, they just refer to them as prostitutes. Before, they refer to them as all these different things because of ignorance. And I highlight those two organizations because they focus primarily in the Black community, whereas in the Black community, they might know tricking. They might know the word tricking or pimps and hoes and all of these different things. And it's just normal part of the culture. And part of their mission is to make sure that they change the language and educate on how this is the same thing that you're experiencing if you're in Goose, South Florida, or if you're in Pinecrest, or if you're in Sunny Isles. It's the same thing, and the resources should be the same across the board. You also mentioned about even culture and how that just plays a big role. Being from a Caribbean family, at one point, it was just common for you to beat your wife. because it was part of the culture for so many other cultures as well too. So it's a perfect segue to Francesco, because you have a different lived experience. You have a different experience even being in the Latin community as well too. So and how that and how all of those intersectionalities really come down to, if we're not here, like you said, checking who we are as the people in the boots, we're really doing a disservice to this work and to all of those who have survived, and making sure that this doesn't happen anymore. So Francesco, we're going to go to you. Thank you so much, Jamaro. Francesco, we're going to go to you. And we have a few questions, especially as it pertains to the intersectionality. What have been some social determinants that influence the vulnerabilities between the LGBTQI community to become victims of sex trafficking, like the marginalization, the poverty, homelessness, the discrimination? And can you also address some of the challenges and barriers that you've experienced as being experienced by the Latino transgender community and the Latino community as a whole?
Sure, Jessica, thank you. And thank you, Deborah. And it's a pleasure to be here with such amazing team. As Jamoro was saying, culture plays a very, very important role in understanding the challenges that people, especially in the context of what I do, which is the work with Latinos, how Latinos are so vulnerable, right? Especially Latino and then LGBT. And there's a lot of conversation about it and how they have the vulnerabilities. And definitely I would start with culture, because unfortunately, especially specific segments of the LGBT community, not only here, but in Latin America, live in high levels of poverty and marginalizations. And remember, it is very important to take into consideration that when we talk about Latino, Hispanics, we're talking about a ethnicity, but also, unfortunately, people forgot that Latinos were very diverse. Within our own communities, we had white Latinos, Black Latinos, indigenous. And then when you go to Latin America, at least for those that are from there or have visited Latin America, they can tell how the levels and the marginalization that take place within these countries, right? So if you are a Latino, and let's say you're a Black Latino or an indigenous Latino, and then you're poor, and then on top of that, you are that you're gay or you're trans or you're bi, that means that right there, you're experiencing in your country high levels of vulnerabilities. And especially what we have seen within the LGBT community is that the sex industry and the sexual exploitation becomes like this very interesting space that kind of consume them, like inviting them to become the only way for them to survive. Then they start this very tragic journey to move to the United States, which is it's a tragic process of immigration in which they're raped and trafficked in each country that they put a step on, right? And I think that's all over the news, but nobody talks about the horrible experiences of gay and trans and lesbian individuals crossing the border and getting into Mexico and Guatemala and being raped and being trafficked. So once they come to United States, which is supposed to be the land of freedom, and they're supposed to come here to live the American dream, what they encounter, it's a specific and very clear barriers that we have in our country, right? Difficulty in accessing services and accessing healthcare, poverty, job, the fact that they're undocumented, the language barrier becomes huge in terms of how they access and kind of manage to get successful in this country. So when you add all those factors, what you have is a human being that is extremely highly vulnerable to get trafficked. And then you add towards that vulnerability and these factors that we're talking about, that unfortunately here in the United States, there's a culture, as well as it is in Latin America, in which the sex industry, especially in Miami, has become so prevalent that it's becoming integrating into providing these individuals this fake space for them to get into. So they get trapped and this kind of hope of getting money and succeeding in the United States, but in reality, that's not happening. What is happening is that they're getting into this human trafficking system that consume them, that take them and lead them to get into substance abuse, which is so sad because we talk a lot about that substance abuse. It's a factor that makes vulnerable individuals to become victims of sex trafficking. But I would say also that sex trafficking leads individuals to become substance dependent because the pain and the horror that these individuals live led them to then consume substance abuse. And you have to put in context the whole cultural aspect of this. Imagine this person that has spent their lives and their time and money and efforts that they got detached from their families and their culture to come to a country that was promised to be a safe place and to be a safe heaven for them, a place where they can start all over again. And what they encounter is a nightmare. It's basically a nightmare. They encounter the same horrors that they live in the country of origin. And on top of that, we have this, especially in the context of LGBT and trans individuals, they do not trust the system. They have very strong issues with the system because they come from countries where impunity was so prevalent, where the justice system was not available for them. And when they come to the United States, the fact that they're undocumented, the fact that they're invisible, and the fact that accessing the justice system, once you got in your mindset that institution, it is not there for you. So here, the levels of impunity in regards of sex trafficking within the LGBT Latino becomes even more prevalent because instead of they seeing the police departments as a friend, instead of they seeing the state attorney's office as an institution that is there for them, what they have in their mind is this very traumatized ideas of the system. And now you place it in this level in which is my idea of what I experience in my country, which I know I cannot trust the system, but now here I'm undocumented, I'm afraid to be deported, I do not know the language, and I've been told that this is what I'm doing, which it was done in my country, but now here I'm going to be prosecuted for it. So it is a very vicious and horrible cycle that basically leads to increment the levels of violence, that leads to increment the vulnerability, and that emerge that person in these very helpless situations in which they do not know what to do. And unfortunately, as a society and as a system, we have so few environments and organizations and systems in place that makes them feel comfortable and safe, and that knows from the cultural perspective how to integrate policies and procedures that would make these communities feel comfortable to move forward and look for justice, and to move forward to look for a better life and to escape from that. So it's very complex. It is very complex, and I can be here talking for hours about it. But I think that this could be a very interesting overall explanation of what we see here, at least at Survivor's Pathway, the challenges that we see in terms of how these individuals experience their own sexual exploitation. And one of the things that I think to close these comments that I think is very devastating for them and devastating for us as victim advocates and as organization, is that they have experienced so much trauma and so much violence that they have normalized it. And they have normalized as well the fact that what the sex exploitation that they going through, it's normal. So once you reach your hands to them, some of them, they don't even realize the level of exploitation that they're going through, because they are just in a survival mode in which they just need to make it. They just need to survive one day to another. And I guess that's something that's a very important factor to take into consideration. Thank you, Jessica.
No, thank you. Thank you so much. And this question, to wrap up, it kind of segues into what what you just mentioned about like those who are undocumented and those who are immigrants and what they're experiencing and resources available. So I'm going to address this question to Nathan, but if any of you guys on the panel have any more information to add to this, please feel free. but it really comes down to the current situation and respect to adjudication of benefits for immigrant survivors of human trafficking. How does the national strategy on gender equity and equality affect human trafficking initiatives? As part of the U.S. National Action Plan, what are some resources or benefits for those who are immigrant survivors?
I'm sorry, Jessica, I got confused. Were you asking me?
Yes, anyone can answer the question. It's really kind of two parts. It just has to do with the adjudication of benefits. So really the dissemination of benefits for immigrant survivors, human trafficking, and or you can address how the national strategy on gender equity and equality affects the human trafficking initiatives.
Okay, is Nathan answering this question?
And I think that actually Maria Jose was the one that posed it, but it's open to the audience, to the panel.
Oh, it's open to the panel. All right.
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
One of the things that it's very relevant is to know that the T visa, it's one of the immigration remedies for immigrants, and in many instances, one of the things that happens a lot as well that I forgot to mention is that the vulnerability that brings the fact that the person can be undocumented, the fear, right, to be deported. It's so great that people allow the perpetrators and the sexual exploiters to exercise this crime for long periods of time because they have been acting under the promise that they will get documentation in this country. And they do not know that we have visas like the U visa and the T visa that can be activated once they report. And at least from the immigration component, I can say that that's one of the benefits that can be applied and given to victims of sex trafficking.
Okay. And Nathan, you're still on mute.
Speak just quickly to the gender policy point that you brought up. I was able to sit in on that briefing when they launched that from the White House briefing. And I think, honestly, I think it is another opportunity where there were groups that will benefit from that. Boys and men, the language boys and men was not included in the underserved groups or the groups that was created to serve or enhance. So I think the policy in itself will advance the movement of human trafficking and survivors for certain groups, and that's wonderful. And so it's challenging as an advocate, as a friend. There continues to be groups that benefit from some of these policies at the national level, but not everyone's being included. So why boys and men is important, or males important in general at that policy level, is LGBTQI was mentioned, girls and women of color were mentioned, two populations, two groups that warrant an additional investment and attention. There's no one's arguing that. But we also, within that language, when males aren't included, we're marginalizing those males that do not identify as LGBTQI. And much research now supports that that's a significant enough number that warrants resources.
Okay, perfect. Okay, and our last question as we transition to our last session for tomorrow. This was I think we would be really in trouble if we did not answer this question or left this question unanswered about the definition. So we've been hearing many other panelists, and even as we get into our last session, discuss trafficking as it pertains to adults and children. Would it still by definition be trafficking if it's an adolescent who forces another adolescent to do any sexual acts in exchange for anything else, drugs or anything? Would that constitute as trafficking as well?
Yes, it would, because the definition itself, it's the definition, right? So it would still constitute definition. But I think what we need to focus on is not the what, but the why, right? Mm-hmm. So if you have another child that has turned from a victim, person with a lived experience, to perpetrator, what we tend to do, and we had a case here in Broward that it was a devastating case. That was a part of a case where there was a young woman that had been charged with trafficking, and because that's what she did, that's what she was doing. However, when we went back, this young lady was known to us. And so she had come to our attention when she was 14, 15 years old, and we had identified and verified her as a sex trafficking victim, right? But now here she is, 19 and 20 years old, being charged with a human trafficking offense. So by definition, yes, trafficking is trafficking. However, we need to start looking at the what, okay? We need to not the what, but the why. Why did this happen? Why did this happen? And we all had to admit, we dropped the ball. We failed her tremendously, right? Now, while I will say Florida does a lot of things right, and we are like above the curve in a lot of things, but let me tell you, we do a lot of things wrong. We do a lot of things wrong, and there are a lot of things that we can be doing better. And that particular case was a perfect example of what we could be doing better. The continuum of care, the lack of continuum of care is a problem. And another problem is the fact that we have, for some reason, interpreted or defined people not getting help when we think they should get help as them not wanting help. It's not that people don't want help, they don't trust help. You have to understand when you're dealing with someone who has experienced chronic complex trauma, which is multiple forms of trauma, okay? And the complexity of it is they've experienced from someone that they either trusted, loved, or thought cared about them. When you're servicing a population that has experienced this type of trauma, it behooves you to understand that everybody's not mentally ill, everybody's not crazy. What you're seeing is a manifestation of suffering, right? What you're seeing is a manifestation of trauma, right? And so it's not that they don't want your help, they don't trust your help, right? And you're not going to get people who have experienced multiple encounters of chronic and complex trauma to trust you in 3 months, because that's what the time limit your grant gave you to help them. You want me to go on, or y'all need to move on?
we got to move on. But listen, it's getting good.
Move on.
If we were in
Excellent.
church, we would have said flow, but we do have to move on. But wow, we just thank you, because we've seen here from this panel how important it is. I want to thank each and every single one of you, just even personally, for the work that you're doing, because if we don't speak up, if you guys don't speak up or even kind of move forward, then nobody really is advocating for these groups. Nobody's advocating for those who identify, who are Black, those who are women, those who are sick, or what people would call straight, gendered males. Nobody's advocating for those in the Latin communities. And it takes us within those communities to be able to speak up, to make sure that all the bases are covered as we help survivors and those continue their healing journey. We thank you again for all of you guys. For those of you who are in the chat, we see there's a lot of attendees. If you'll take a moment, you see that my colleague Patricia has dropped in the chat the link to the survey. If you have not already completed, please take the time to complete the survey. We do need it for our funders. It allows for us to continue to provide a lot of these symposiums, trainings, and all the work that we do free of charge. And with that, we're gonna go ahead and transition into our third session. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Very good. All right. And we are going to bring up the PowerPoint for session 3. Thank you, Sybil. And this is the contact information for for the panelists for session 2, for Francesco Jumaro and Nathan Earl. You all will receive this. And let's go ahead and bring up session 3. Very good. Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Bradell Canfield, Program Manager for Project Gold, as well as Teresa Kennedy, Chief of Operations for Christie House, and Alicia Garcia Priovalos, Director of the Human Trafficking Unit, Assistant State Attorney's, Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office. Good afternoon, ladies, and they are going to discuss survivor-centered care and leadership. Take it away. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Deborah. It's wonderful to be here with everyone with such a great panel and some awesome sessions. And thank you everyone for tuning in. Go ahead to the next slide. So when talking about survivor-centered care, it's important to know the difference, right, between survivor-centered, survivor-informed, and survivor-led. And many people don't quite know the difference, right? So I tend to view these three different components as steps to a ladder of sorts, where survivor-centered is at the base, survivor-informed is the next step, and survivor-led is at the top. And so I will hand it to Teresa to walk us through survivor-centered to start.
Thank you, Bradell. Next slide, please. Thank you. So when we talk about survivor-centered, we're really talking about an approach that applies the most basic human rights to an approach to your programming and the designing of programming to ensure that a survivor's rights and needs are first and foremost in all ways. This is something that all folks should be able to do, honestly, right? Because this is the most basic level. You're going to be, really thinking about what the needs and concerns are of the individuals that you're serving, and also recognizing all the time that those needs are unique and individual to each person that you're serving. You shouldn't think that you can, kind of have I always like to refer to it as like programming in a box, where you just come up and you develop a program and that's going to meet the needs and outcomes for all of the individuals that you're serving. It's important for us to continue to recognize that each person's, their experience and their exploitation is different, and how they are able to move forward in their transition and in their recovery is going to be different. And we as providers need to be mindful of those things and thoughtful as to what it is that we have available to those folks. The survivor-centered approach really aims to create a supportive environment in which the survivors' rights are respected at all times, and that they are always treated with dignity and respect. We need to focus on their ability to identify and express their needs and wants in that process. That it's not about us telling folks what it is that they need, but it's about us sitting back and really listening and paying attention to what it is that they're either showing us or that they're actually telling us. Next slide, please.
Yeah, I just want to add to that too, Teresa. That to me, really, being survivor-centered, in essence, is being trauma-informed, right? And being survivor-centered is really seeing and acknowledging the fact that, trauma impacts like every single human being around us, right? And through being survivor-centered or trauma-informed, we're actively seeing and operating from that lens of reality that trauma affects all people, to acknowledge the role that trauma plays, right? So that we're actually able to go ahead and provide services that meet the unique needs of those individuals that we serve. So also when we are survivor-centered, we're listening to that individual, amplifying their voices and changing things according to what they say they need, right? So we're viewing them as the experts of their lives and letting them speak to their needs and resituating services as needed. And so then through that sensitivity, we're able to create services that don't re-traumatize and that create a space for someone to express their needs.
Thank you, Brittany. And I think, just to elaborate, and give some examples when we're talking about, being trauma informed, it's important for us to be honest in what that means, right? It's easy for folks to say, they're trauma informed. And in some cases that might mean that you're asking your staff to take a one-time webinar on trauma informed care. And that does not create a trauma-informed team. It's important for us to recognize that this is something that needs to be an ongoing process and an ongoing learning process. And that in some cases, maybe your own agency may not be the best place to provide that training. Maybe you need to look out in the community and find those folks that are doing the work, that have better, more experience, and could better train your staff to help them to understand how to work with this population and how to become more trauma informed. And when you have folks on your team that may actually be survivors and those with lived experience, it's important to think about what does that supervision look like for those folks. You know, as a manager or a supervisor, you need to be a little more thoughtful about what that looks like and how you're going to work with that person to help them to achieve their personal goals and their professional goals, because their experience in the workplace may look very different than someone who hasn't experienced the same level of trauma or exploitation than other folks who may be working right in the office along with them. You know, being able to offer them choices about, you know, being flexible in, you know, within that work and giving them options on, you know, maybe there's a need to work from home at a time, you know, because that would, you know, really be more supportive for them. Or maybe, you know, you need to just think about, you know, the hours that they're working. Burdell, please, if you could, you know, help give a few more examples in this. You know, I think a lot of the folks on here know that I'm very new to Christie House and Project Gold. So I definitely want to pass it over to you to share some more thoughts with the folks here on the training.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the flexibility piece is really important, and understanding that this work is triggering for all people, but it hits home in a very different way when you're someone who's experienced exploitation yourself. And so keeping that in mind, that if a survivor advocate, for example, is sitting in courts all day long, listening to different child's needs and situations, like that can be a lot to take on. And so, you know, maybe they need to go work the rest of the day from home, you know, and just being mindful about that and being supportive the best that we can be.
Thank you. Next slide, Sybil. So really that next step or that next level is when we start speaking about being survivor informed. And that's really looking at, you know, a practice that involves very much that same, you know, victim-centered approach and trauma-informed approach to all things that you're doing. So when it comes to outreach, public awareness campaigns, case management services that you're delivering, direct services, in looking at building coalitions or task forces within your community, making sure that, you know, all of that is always in the front and center of your mind as you're going forward with these steps. Having real meaningful survivor input is going to impact all areas of your agency in a positive way. And I think it's important for us to remember when we say all agency, we mean all agency, right? So not just the program that's supporting and serving survivors and those with lived experience, but if your program serves other populations, we want to make sure that all folks within the agency are survivor informed, because we know at any time we could have someone walking through our door that has not even yet themselves identified as being a person who may have experienced some form of sexual exploitation. But if the folks that are working there are educated and informed, then how they're going to treat that person is going to be more appropriate and more supportive and more trauma informed. And we also may be able to identify some additional needs that folks may have that they didn't even realize that they had. Survivors really need to influence the decision-making and the design of how we are creating our programming. So really taking that time to not ask if someone is okay with a decision that's already been made, but bringing that conversation to folks before decisions are being made, seeking that feedback and that input, and asking folks to be at the table while decisions are being made. You know, if we're creating some sort of, you know, survey to be given to our members, then we should not be having the folks that, you know, if you have folks with lived experience and members that have that experience, why would we not want to reach out to them to ask them to help us to create these things? Because we're going to be more thoughtful and more likely to have folks actually participate in that process after those things are created.
So something to note is that, you know, although many agencies work really hard at being survivor-centered and survivor informed, many could do more work in making sure that the policies and procedures are also survivor informed, which is something, you know, I greatly admire about Project Gold for doing, is noticing that need and implementing survivor informed and survivor led policies and procedures. And then I'll also add a caveat to being survivor informed in that there's a lot of tokenizing, sadly, within the industry. Something we are all campaigning and educating against, but agencies do sometimes seek survivor feedback to be able to say that they are survivor informed, rather than to actually apply that feedback to their systems. And it's really paramount that a survivor feedback is sought out of the respect and regard for their unique perspectives and input as individuals and as professionals in the field of their work.
Thank you. Next slide. So what does that look like, and how does, you know, how do we try to, you know, be survivor informed here at Christie House? One of the things that Project Gold did was to develop a member advisory board. So now we, you know, have a mechanism to, you know, really be able to get that feedback on a regular basis from members that have participated and received services from us, to really, you know, kind of be that check for ourselves. Like, is what we're doing, you know, are we doing what we're doing in the best way that we can? Is it impactful? Is it helpful? Really, you know, having that voice coming directly from our members, and really having them help us to continue to improve the programming that we're doing. And you know, I say that point of continue to improve because it's really important for all of us as service providers to recognize that even when we're doing good work, we're not done. We need to constantly look at the work that we're doing, really pay attention to whether or not we're having the impact that's intended. Could we be doing better? Or do we need to seek consultation from folks who maybe have been doing it longer? You know, are there things that we can learn? And yeah, sometimes that's going to cost money. And then that means we need to figure out how to make it happen, because just saying that you've been working in the industry for, you know, 5 years, 10 years isn't enough. We need to make sure that what we're doing is relevant to what we're seeing within our communities today, because what we saw 5 years ago is not what we're seeing right now. We know that things have changed, so we need to make sure that we are, you know, really relevant in the approaches that we're using to be able to bring new members in and to support those that we actually have. Bradell, do you have more to share?
Yep. Oh, you can go to the next slide. So those that are working in this field, whatever your role may be, are working, you're playing a part in the anti-trafficking movement, right? We're all working within a movement. You're playing whatever role it is that you're playing in this movement, and who we do have at the head of the forefront of this movement matters exponentially, as it does with any and every major movement. Next slide, please. So let's think of who's leading some big movements. The Black Lives Matters, LGBTQ rights movement, Indigenous land rights movement, girls' rights to education, #MeToo, marriage equality, women's rights to drive. There's certainly allies in every movement. However, those that are really at the forefront, affecting vision and direction and being the voice, are those who are directly affected by the oppression or the abuse that is being advocated and fought against. So survivor leadership exists and is essential at multiple layers of any movement as well. And this includes this movement. Next slide, please. So Rachel Lloyd, who's the founder of GEMS up in New York and a pioneer in the world of survivor leadership for over 20 years, defines survivor-led services as a system that strives to incorporate the voice of survivors, ensuring that development and implementation of programming is driven by their experience and expertise. And she also goes on to define that survivor leadership acknowledges that survivors are more than their experience of abuse and exploitation. Rather, they are experts who should ultimately lead and make changes to the anti-trafficking movement. So I think that two major issues must be addressed in any space that is wishing to be survivor-led. and that's stigma and biases and tokenism, right? So individuals impacted by human trafficking often have to deal with stigma, biases, and microaggressions. A space must be willing to see survivors as more than their quote unquote stories. And less motivated to just sort of check off or tick off that box that says like, hey, we're survivor informed, or hey, we're survivor led, and instead genuinely view these individuals as the experts they are and for the expertise they have to share. And without that, are we really allowing them to lead within their own movement, or is it rather patronizing? And a third factor is creating fertile ground for them to grow within their roles, their skills, professionally and personally. When survivors have the safe and fertile ground to grow from, like anyone else, they will grow. Their leadership gets stronger, their vision, their voice, what they have to offer, all of it. Offering trainings and assist them with their needs for growing in these avenues and strengthening their skills are essential, as well as professional mentorship. And it really is no different than everyone is a professional. Everyone's needs, regardless of being a survivor or not, but often due to lack of funds or resources or the stigma and biases, this is a missed opportunity for growth and for survivor leadership. So when we are able to view survivors as the experienced experts that have so much vision and knowledge to offer that they are, then we're able to have effectively and ethically have survivors at the forefront of protocols and decision-making, program structure and implementation, legislation, and really all areas and corners of this movement. And it also involves having a major influence on decisions and being the drivers of this movement, period. And that's layered because it applies to all areas of the movement, from the layers of direct services and agency programming, policies, procedures, culture, all the way to laws and statutes and innovative new approaches. Next slide, please. So some examples of how we've been able to be survivor-led at Project Gold is member programming, right? So I really tried to encourage the survivors that we have on staff to use their voice and share their perspectives on maybe things they could see that could be done differently or better, so that we're using more than just my perspective, right? So we can use everyone's perspectives on how we're doing member programming, as Teresa mentioned earlier, like input on the surveys that we're giving to the youth, overall program design, having survivor voices on the leadership team, overlooking and creating policies and procedures, part of the hiring practices, and elevating really just the voice in all areas of the program, as I mentioned. Next slide, please. So within the survivor community, I've heard a lot of unfortunate stories of employment, which led me to want to do research on the topic of what's being done right, what could be done better within organizations that are employing survivors. And so we put together this pilot study and published it, and I did so with Claire Helpingstein, Dr. Maureen Kenny. And the reason really for the study was because survivors are employed, in all these different agencies, and there's very little known about their role in these agencies, and it hasn't been examined, right? And so we wanted to take a look at, if tokenism is going on in all these different aspects that I've been mentioning. So in the results, we found that 2 survivors reported feeling overworked and undercompensated in their positions. 50% of survivors reported moderate or extreme dissatisfaction with their salary. 69% of survivors felt that they were treated differently at work due to their survivor status. There were also findings that participants were put in situations where they feel obligated to share their stories without consent. Similarly, 38% felt obligated to share their story with community members, such as donors, on behalf of their employer, using survivor stories for fundraising and donations. And participants who reported these experiences were able to elaborate upon their effects in an open response format. And so survivors reported feeling exploited or used by their organizations, when these situations occurred. So one participant stated, obviously I felt completely used, I wasn't compensated, and I had already been exploited previously by another organization who used my story to build their organization. Participants also reported feeling as if their identities were limited to that of a quote unquote survivor and opposed to being viewed as a professional with lived experience. And the sentiment was explained by a few of the participants. One of them who said, quote, I feel like I constantly have to decide if I'm representing my professional expertise or my survivor expertise, quote. Next slide, please. So we also found that 31.1% felt that their caseloads were frequently or always too high. And then most of them reported an average of 20 being too many cases to manage at one time. Next slide, please. Overall, another thing to note is that 94% of the participants sought professional therapy or counseling services outside of their agency. And one participant noted the challenges faced when organizations do not respect the need for treatment, stating others among the team don't understand the level of trauma and the healing that has taken place to be able to work direct services after everything that's happened to us. Next slide. So participants were asked to reflect upon the challenges that they had faced during their employment as a mentor or direct service provider to other CSE survivors, and issues regarding a lack of funding and the absence of necessary resources to serve their clients was a challenge for many and an important area that participants felt that needed to be improved. One of the most common challenges discussed by participants was in regard to being seen as a credible source of information in the field. And for many, there appeared to be a sense that survivors are not seen as equal to their non-CSE surviving colleagues in terms of capacity to work. Like, so for example, experiencing triggers and stigma or judgment due to being a survivor and their level of expertise. And one participant stated the challenges such as not being treated as credible or reliable, even when being pushed to share expertise. We also found that a big reason some survivors don't feel comfortable expressing their triggers in the workplace is due to the concern that they may experience the ramifications of existing stereotypes or biases towards survivors, or that they need to fit the mold of a quote unquote model survivor. And one of them stated, I did not feel comfortable sharing my triggers because oftentimes I felt like the other women on staff who were not survivors had made comments in regards to survivors being hard to work with and being easily triggered. Next slide, please. And so participants' recommendations to correct these issues included the recognition and respect of boundaries and trainings for organizational staff to better understand and work collaboratively with. The absence of other survivors in the workplace arose as a concern for some participants also. And in these instances, participants described organizations' solicitations for survivor input as sometimes disingenuous. So for example, a participant stated, some agencies request a survivor input and it feels as if they request it so they can say that they did. However, they do not take the input and apply it. And so participants also advocated for more survivor involvement in the field and noted the importance of differentiating between what is survivor-led and what is survivor-informed when it comes to an organization. Next slide, please. And so the implications of the study tells us that we must ensure that it is survivors' choice to share their story, that it's important to explore authentic consent. It's important to ensure that they are adequately compensated, being mindful of the risk of recidivism. We should always provide adequate resources for an individual to do their job. And it highlights the necessity of supporting mental health care, being flexible for it, and being trauma informed. Next slide, please. So within this movement, we all have a to-do list to work towards effectively and ethically being survivor-centered, survivor-informed, and survivor-led. And that includes reviewing policies and procedures, reviewing agency policies and procedures to identify and remove any that are potentially unsafe and harmful to trafficking victims within histories of trauma, continued trainings, providing education and training for all staff that supports a cohesive, survivor-centered, sensitive working environment for all staff, and maintain support of that culture. Seeking to be survivor informed, to weave that input and expertise throughout all of programming. Receive consulting and trainings from survivor leaders who are great examples on being survivor informed and survivor led. It's also really important to seek guidance of those who are considered experts in the field of direct services, survivor-centered approaches, bearing best practices and approaches, survivor leadership, and really any and all areas that you may endeavor in within this movement. And ongoing assessments. It's really important to continue to assess what we are doing, how we are doing it, and keeping up with how things are evolving within the movement so that we can continue growing with the movement, with survivor-centered and survivor-informed best practices and procedures. Next slide, please.
So we just, pulled some resources for you guys and I believe that the PowerPoint will be shared with those who are on the call today. Just to kind of give you some places and ideas of where you can go to look to get some additional information to take your agency to the next level, to get to that place of, either, if you're not yet, feel as if you're not yet survivor informed, and how you can get there to get, to reach the goal of, hopefully one day being survivor led. We recognize that GEMS has done a lot of work in their field. They are a female, a program only serving females, but a lot of their information would be valuable for any folks to, take the time. We also recognize our partners here in Miami-Dade County with the Citrus Chance program, knowing the work that they do and for how long they've been doing it. They do, we reach out to them to do trauma-informed care training for our staff here at Project Gold. And then just looking at some other options that are out there, like through HHS, they have specifically some guidelines for survivor-informed practice, and then some additional information related to survivor-centered and survivor-led practices through the Youth Collaboratory. I think that is everything for us as far as our PowerPoint.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you. Thank you, Bertel. Thank you, Teresa. So we're going to continue on with some questions. I just want to say, as I was listening to Bertel and Teresa, and I was sort of unpacking what we heard in session 2 with providing services to all individuals who have experienced trafficking. It really, I'm beginning to put it together and to unpack it in the sense that not only is my own self-reflection needed, and also the ongoing assessments are always needed, not only on an individual level, but on an agency level and on a cultural level. And it just, I think about what Jamara was saying about culture, about honoring, individuals' cultures, the lived experience, their unique needs, understanding how they identifying why it is that they have a lack of trust. What can we do to change that? The importance of being given a voice, not only in the type of services that they're going to receive, but given a voice also in the leadership, of the movement, whatever movement it is that they choose to engage in. So thank you. So I'm going to start off with a couple of questions here. And Alicia, I'm going to start off with you, if that's all right, my dear. So how does the state attorney's office handle a victim-centered approach?
Awesome. Thank you so much for the question, and thank you so much for having us here at the table. I am very blessed to have been the director now for the last 4 years here at the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office, and to be working under the leadership Catherine Hernandez Rundle. And having listened to some of the answers that have been previously given, I want to say that learning is really important. And so it has been a learning process for us and for Ms. Rundle, who's made it her priority to focus on human trafficking and to focus on learning about what we should be doing. So here at the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office, we've learned that we didn't really know much about human trafficking, and we've had to change the ways that we prosecute cases and that we handle things, even from a legal perspective, in order to best serve our victims and our survivors. So what we've learned is we also need to listen. We need to listen to our survivors, and we need to listen to them and to their needs, and we need to change the way that we normally handle traditional prosecutions. So since 2012, we have been on that learning process, on that journey. And what we've learned is that when we handle these cases that come to us as a result of arrests, we need to understand the place that that victim or that survivor is at the time that we encounter them, and we need to move forward accordingly. So what does that mean as a prosecutor or as a prosecuting office? Well, that means that not every case that we encounter, even though that person has been trafficked, will result in human trafficking charges. And so what that means is we must look at the case overall, at the victim, at the survivor, see where they're at, and possibly pursue other charges. We may possibly not pursue charges, but the first thing that we must address is those needs that that person has at that exact time. And so what we have done is we have changed the way that our unit works and who makes up that unit. So as part of the victim-centered approach that we have, or the survivor-centered approach, is that we have on staff 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, prosecutors, law enforcement, and victim advocates working together. And so that's really the first thing that we do. And so when we encounter a victim or a survivor, we must, one, figure out the resources that are immediately needed to service that person. And then we must look at what are all the crimes that have been committed, and is this victim ready to come forward, and how do we prosecute that? Sometimes that means going after their trafficker for other crimes that they've committed in addition to human trafficking. Sometimes that means going forward on human trafficking charges. And sometimes that means waiting and collecting additional evidence and allowing that person or that individual who has come forward to feel more secure and say, okay, the case isn't just riding on my testimony, because there's all this other evidence that has come forward. So that makes me feel more empowered and more able to come forward on a prosecution. And so that journey that we started in 2012 when we started this unit has gone bigger and bigger throughout the years, but we also understand that we must continue to educate ourselves and continue to change the way that we do things, because crime is always changing and people are always at different places. So what we've done is we've created a bunch of resources and partners and collaborators, like some of the people that are here today. And we've created, for example, a local hotline where survivors could call, victims could call, but so could family members, and so could other individuals. And we could still provide them and put them in touch with resources if it is needed. Or we could send police officers to go speak to them who are specially trained to understand the complexities that victims go through, survivors go through, as well as families go through. For example, when dealing with children and survivors and victims of human trafficking that are minors, we must also, learn that families don't know how to deal with these problems. And sometimes families are asking for help and they don't know how to ask for help for their children, or sometimes they don't know how to respond to some of the trauma that the children then have. So it becomes a completely different animal, basically, the way we handle these cases. Not only is the way that we charge it different, the evidence that we collect, it's different. We provide that immediate care, but we've even created a building where we handle all of our cases that is separate and apart from all of our other prosecutions. Why? Because we realized that once we recover these children, right? Because we haven't rescued them yet. Rescue them is when they're fully, getting all the services. When we recover these children initially, or these adults, which we also see, they're in need of a lot of resources and immediate care. So our building right now, the way that it is designed, is we have a floor in which all of our victim services are there for them, which include, immediate toiletries or clothing or advocates that are there for them. We also have a law enforcement floor, and we have a prosecution floor, so that we could all be there together to help and continue the process of recovery and rescuing them. We also learned that our advocacy is not just in the courtroom, but it's also in the legislature. Every year we go to the legislature and we advocate for additional laws, or to change the laws that are in place to better focus them on fighting this horrible crime. Sometimes that means education. Sometimes that means creating laws that will educate the community, or that will force businesses to educate their people. Sometimes it means, like Dr. Coonan said earlier, the deposition initiative right now that we're leading, and that is to recognize that victims of human trafficking or victims of sexual assault are traumatized by these depositions that occur in court. So can we change the way that things are being done in the state of Florida? Sometimes that means that us as prosecutors, we must go out and educate the community, educate our officers, our law enforcement, and educate ourselves. Every year, for example, we hire about 60 to 65 prosecutors in our office to start a new class. And every year we must re-educate those prosecutors to learn about human trafficking, learn about how to conduct their pre-files and their investigations and their cases, but also learn how to spot human trafficking. Because believe it or not, as much education as we've done over the years, it's still missed, it's still misunderstood. And even within law enforcement, they still miss it. So we must be those second eyes that continue to look for human trafficking and continue to change what we see. Every year we learn about new cases or new ways that human trafficking is occurring. And one of the things that we must do is continue to educate that, those TV movies that we see that, put a blindfold on our community, that human trafficking occurs in many different ways and looks very different. In Miami, for example, we are a very diverse community. So the human trafficking that we see occurring in one community looks completely different than it looks in another community. I mean, as Francesco was talking about, the Latin human trafficking looks different than the Asian community. It looks different than the African American community. And if we must open our eyes and continue to educate what we're seeing through our cases, we must educate our communities to say, hey, this is also happening in your community. It just might not look like what's happening next door. So educating our community, believe it or not, is now part of our role as prosecutors. And so we must continue to build on what we have and learn that although we believe we know a lot, we have to continue to even educate ourselves. So that's just part of our victim-centered approach, because if we're not doing that, then there's going to be victims out there that don't fall within what we've seen before that are not helped. And so that is part of what our victim-centered approach has been and will continue to be here at the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office.
Thank you, Alicia. I appreciate your sharing and the information. And it's so good to know and so happy to know that we're all working together in this, or on this. I have a question that came in from one of our participants, and I believe it would be directed to you, Alicia, but I'll leave it open to the panelists. And says, as a district attorney, we sometimes have youth who committed charges such as battery. However, we know that the child has previously been trafficked. Is there a way to approach these kids and keep them accountable while being sensitive to what they've experienced previously?
So as a prosecutor, we are very fortunate in Miami-Dade County that we're allowed to use prosecutorial discretion. And so that doesn't mean you give a pass to everyone, but it means that you must use your judgment to understand why that defendant that you have before you is before you, and understand that not everybody has to be punished, you know, in the same fashion to the same extent, because everybody's circumstances are different. So in our office, for example, we have different programs. So that youth might fall into one of those programs. That youth might fall into a diversion program where they're not prosecuted, but they also may fall into a program that kind of holds them responsible for what they've done, but helps them and provides them with resources. One of the questions that was asked earlier was, you know, can a youth traffic a youth? And we too have experienced that, and that's a very difficult question. We see that most often with, you know, what we've come to learn as our bottoms, you know, who are recruiting, right? In the terminology of sex trafficking, and what do you do with those? So I think what we do is every case is an individual, every youth is an individual, every defendant is an individual, and you need to try and do your best to treat each and every case with a trauma-informed approach and a victim-centered approach as well, because if they are an offender, there's also a victim on the other side as well. So you kind of have to try to take both views on it.
Deborah, if I could add a little bit to that from the service provider perspective, is that, you know, from our role, we have, you know, really the responsibility to advocate for those youth, right? So if we have that information and know that there is more to that story than that battery arrest, that, you know, if other folks at the state attorney's office don't know that, how do we help that young person to share that story as they're going through this process? Because I have, you know, I've seen times where, you know, we might be at an MDT staffing and we're asking those kind of questions, and folks may not know whether or not anybody else knows what's going on in this young person's life that could be bringing them to, you know, a court hearing with the Department of Juvenile Justice. So as service providers connected to these young people, we should help them to be able to, you know, and help and encourage and empower them to use their voice to make sure that the folks that they're now coming across within the delinquency system have an understanding of all things that are going on that may have led them to that actual arrest.
Very good. Thank you, Teresa.
Can I also add to that, Deborah, if you don't mind, with respects to the service piece with the involving the criminality. So what is happening in Broward County with the Broward County State Attorney's Office? We are in the process, and we have been for a few months now, of developing our HT diversion program for minors. And so what's happening is we've partnered with the Nancy J. Cotterman Center, which is our primary human trafficking victim services provider in Broward County at this time. And so as Teresa was talking about with the MDSs in Broward County, what will happen is if we have a young person that has been charged, has a criminal offense, has been charged, and then they're before the CSEC HT multidisciplinary staffing team with an offense, whether that child has priors or not, we, our office, our juvenile division is considering those cases for diversion. And so what's happening is those cases are being considered for diversion, and then those cases are being referred to the Nancy J. Cotterman Center for that specific human trafficking case management, therapeutic treatment that they may need. So what happens is so even though they're coming in with a criminal offense, we are stepping back from the punitive measures, and we're trying to provide services, because we do know that, you know, at any given moment, a child that has been identified as CSEC or sex trafficked, and they're coming through with an offense, a lot of times they're under the control, most of the time they're under control of a pimp or a trafficker or an exploiter. And so rather than continue to criminalize that child and further traumatize that child, the Broward State Attorney's Office is looking extensively at these cases and saying, okay, we may not need to add any more trauma. We're not going to add any more trauma to this child's life, and we're going to send this case to diversion so this child can get the help that they need.
Very good. Thank you, Jamaro.
Deborah, if I could, that kind of answers a little bit of one of the questions we have from the audience, but if I could just add something to that. how would you, all of you guys who just shared the information, how would you approach if the kids, how to keep children accountable if the offense is not related to human trafficking?
And I think as a prosecutor, you know, we work collectively with all the partners that are here today, actually, and we listen to what, you know, what's been said, what's the issues, what's the background, what's the home situation, you know, what does this child need, and remember, not every child needs to be criminalized, and especially when we're dealing with victims who are survivors of human trafficking, we have to try to provide them with the resources and with the help to become a productive member of society. And, you know, when they are juveniles, you know, their brain system is underdeveloped, you know, it hasn't fully developed. So we take that into account. You have to look at the crime itself, where the crime has been committed, and kind of take everything on a case-by-case basis, and work with the juvenile system as well. You know, we have Grace Court here as well, that refers victims of human trafficking as well. So it's a global picture. There's not an easy answer that I can give you. It's open your eyes, listen to everybody, and listen to all the information that's coming in, and then try to put that child in a better place.
Very, very good. Thank you, Alicia. Thank you. Does anyone else want to comment?
Well, I'll just say in Broward County, we don't really need, even if the case isn't linked to the actual trafficking, we're looking at the manifestation of the behavior. So even though the charge is not linked to trafficking, the behavior may be the behavior is linked to the trafficking or the sexual exploitation. And so the child's behavior and the child's criminal behavior is a manifestation of the trauma that the child is experiencing, right? So even though the charge is not looked to an actual trafficker, if the child has been identified as someone that is being trafficked or commercial sexually exploited, we're looking beyond that and looking at the behavior, looking at the you know, why is this child doing this? Why is this child committing these crimes? And so those answers, and we have girls, they have Grace Court in Miami-Dade. We have Girls Court here in Broward County, which was created and is overseen by Judge Stacey Ross. And so even though we're not saying, okay, well, this child committed this offense while they were with a trafficker, if a child committed an offense, we're staffing this child, we see some underlying issues, or the child has been verified as trafficking, boom, there's the manifestation for that behavior, that even though there's a criminal offense, that child needs to receive case management and therapeutic services for commercial sexual exploitation or trafficking.
Very good. Okay. Thank you. So with that in mind, I just want to, is Katina still on?
Yes, I'm still here.
Hi, Katina.
Hi.
What about law enforcement? What are some of the challenges that you all have, or how do you, not the challenges necessarily, but how do you all approach the survivor-centered care?
Well, honestly, Alicia pretty much explained it all, but
okay.
But what we do is, I'll just say, you know, as an officer myself personally, it depends on the situation, depends on the surrounding. If, let's say we're in a search warrant and it happens to be a search warrant for something other than trafficking, and this actually happened. And there was a search warrant going on for a subject who was being investigated for trafficking guns and drugs. And he happened to have women in his house climbing out the back of the window. So we're going in there, right, with badges and vests and guns and police and, you know, so it's very scary for anyone who's in there, especially those girls. They're not going to come out in front of their pimps and say, hey, help me, I'm a victim. So once we see that type of behavior, we have to basically, you know, soften our approach. First of all, make sure everything is clear. And then sometimes we have to ground our gear, our weapons, take them to a soft room. A soft room is not a police station, or it could be in our office, but it's more of like a couch setting with a nice, comfortable area. And just, you know, offer them whatever needs whatever they need. This particular home, these girls were addicted to drugs, so they needed to go to detox. So we offered that, and then we offered help with, I was able to actually keep in touch with them while they were during detox and pick them up from detox and take them to a safe place and speak with them and work with them through the prosecution. So it's things like that where we have to, see these girls are not part of what we're doing this search warrant for. These are actual victims. Once we spoke with them, we realized they were victims of human trafficking and they were cooperative. There's other situations where they encounter first or they speak with a service provider and they're not ready to speak with law enforcement, but I have a good relationship with the service provider and they say, I have this victim, but she's not ready to speak with you yet. And then we'll just work together. And then, I happen to be an approachable person. And most of my team are, my team are all very trained professionals who have been working trafficking cases for many years. So we are very, very different types of investigators who are very experienced with having these conversations, not interrogating survivors. So basically, again, it just depends on the situation, the scene. Obviously, officer safety is always first. Safety for others is always first. And once that is cleared, we are all about their needs. Do you need detox? Do you need medical attention? Do you have medication? If we take you to a safe place, do you have your medication? Do we need to help you get your medication? Do you need to make a phone call? Do you need to take a bath? Do you need to brush your teeth? Just things like that. Just anything personal that shows this person that they are cared for and they're special and they have rights.
All right. Thank you, Katina. So what I'm also hearing is that it's not, that our agencies, we do not work in as an island alone, and we don't work in silos. And so we all have to be a survivor, utilize this approach. And we also have to be willing to communicate with one another because the youth, the child, the person with the lived experience, their needs need to come first. We are at a point where we need to begin to wrap up. I do want to ask one or two more questions to Teresa and to Burdell specifically. And so I think that we would be amiss if we just didn't touch upon COVID and everything that has happened and how it has impacted not only our lives, but the way we have to do our work. And so with that in mind, what programming challenges has Project Gold and to all of you at large, what programming challenges have you encountered as a result of COVID, to be able to implement your programs at Project Gold or otherwise? It can be Teresa, Burdell, or
So in 2020, when we had our first initial shutdown, we had to move. Group programming is a big part of the services we provide. So girls come in for groups 4 days a week, and so we had to transition not just our groups but our individual services completely virtual. With a population that best thrives with in-person attention. So that presented a lot of challenges in and of itself. And within that transition, as numbers started to get a little bit more lax, we were able to transition into more of a hybrid approach. So part in-person, part virtual, and then eventually in person, where we had to just have all the necessary precautions in place for everyone's safety. It did affect numbers, certainly as far as attendance and engagement. A lot of our members are young moms as well. And so just the risk of children getting sick, we wouldn't be having those members with their young children coming into the drop-in center. And so there was also that fall in engagement there, because those services largely have to be out in their homes to go see them as opposed to coming to the drop-in center. So we definitely had some challenges as far as engagement, just because it works better with this population to be in person and more hands-on.
Thank you. Anything else? Okay, and thank you, Burdell. And lastly, what type of, we talked about trainings and self-reflection, not only individually, self-assessment. What trainings do you all recommend? or to ensure a victim-centered approach, and make sure that I'm phrasing the question correctly. Hold on. I want to make sure I'm saying it correctly. Right, exactly. So what kinds of trainings do you feel are relevant or necessary when moving in the direction of being survivor-led? So that's the correct question. Verdell, you want to answer that for us, or Teresa? Anyone?
I would say trauma informed. Does anybody agree? Trauma informed.
Absolutely, trauma informed. I know that we Chance Citrus Health Network, they do a trauma informed care training that I think it has a lot of great information in there. I think it's important to do ongoing training too, and not necessarily always the same training, right? It's nice to get a variety of different trainings, but on the same topic, to keep us trauma informed and more importantly, trauma responsive. As far as things needed, because the question was towards being not just survivor centered, but survivor led as well, correct?
Yes, yes. So when we're beginning to move from from survivor centered or survivor informed to survivor led, what types of training can staffs?
Well, definitely as far as educating on the importance of survivor leadership within this movement, educating people on that, because you have stepped into a movement when you work within this movement, right? So educating yourself on the importance of survivor leadership, the roles that survivors play within this movement. And then also, I know My Life, My Choice, Audrey herself does a training on allyship, which I think is really crucial. I used to say that if you're truly survivor centered and survivor informed, then if you're not already, you're at least aspiring to be survivor led. And I feel differently now, because it's not for everyone to create survivor leadership within their agency, because what's absolutely essential ingredient in that is your reasoning as to why, right? So you have to be a really strong ally to support survivor leadership. Otherwise, we're inevitably going to be doing more harm than good. And that's okay, because we all have different roles to play. And maybe, pushing survivor leadership within your particular program is not what's needed right now, because survivor allyship is key and essential to best support that.
Deborah, if I could add something very quickly, I think that it's very important to understand that trauma it's like a threefold. So you have interpersonal trauma, then there's systemic trauma, and then there's structural trauma, right? And so when you're talking about interpersonal trauma, and I think it's very important for those who are survivor allies and those who are survivor leaders and those who are writing these grants for all of this funding and the people that are running these programs to understand the threefold of trauma: the interpersonal, the systemic, and the structural. So when you're talking about the interpersonal, you're talking about the childhood sexual abuse, the childhood physical, the verbal, the emotional abuse, the domestic violence, the sexual violence, the rape, and the neglect. And then when you're looking at the systemic portion of it, you're talking about people that have been traumatized through the court system, the foster care system, educational system, incarceration, police, law enforcement, and healthcare. And then when you're looking at structural, you're talking about racism, poverty, sexism, homophobia, and all of the other isms. And I think that it's so important for all of us to be aware of these different forms of trauma and the different folds, and how you're going to, on any given day, touch someone or be working with someone or be assigned to someone that has been touched by every single one of these folds: interpersonal, systemic, and structural. And so it's not just about the trafficking, it's about all of the other forms of trauma that they have endured throughout their life that probably led them up to becoming vulnerable to a trafficker.
Well said, Jamaro. Well said. Thank you for sharing that. Yes, yes. Very good. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for participating. We are wrapping it up. I'm going to invite Sybil, will you go ahead and share the Christie House PowerPoint so that we can say thank you. On behalf of myself, I want to thank all of the panelists for participating today. Thank you so very much. Thank you so much for putting up with my emails and all of that wonderful jazz. Thank you for the work that you do, for your knowledge and for your profound words. I look forward to continue doing this and to improve myself in what I am doing. Everyone that is here, I just want to say, please take a moment and complete the pre and the post test. It is very important to us to receive that information, to ensure that we're actually, that you all are achieving some learning gains, and the education, the words that we are sharing with you, that it is reaching you, and that you are learning or receiving the information. So please take a moment and complete that. Once you hit the submit button, you will receive your scores, and you will also receive links within an email that will give you access to all of the PowerPoint presentations that were offered today. In addition to that, give us a week or two, but we will have the recording of this webinar available on Christie House's website. And we're also going to do the very best that we can to gather all of the questions and have them available on the website as well. So on my behalf, I say thank you, and I say, Jessica, take us out, my dear.
Yes. So thank you to everyone. So as I just kind of wrote down some notes here, just some questions to really ask all of our for us to take the time to ask ourselves. We saw in session 1, and one of the things we can take away from that is how we can become a better advocate individually as a person and as an agency as well too. What are some steps? Firstly, becoming educated in your state, in your respective agencies and counties. How can we become more educated in helping change some of the laws that we see aren't really supporting survivors? And how do we further evangelize for those that are supporting survivors, and making sure that they're knowing as much as possible the different resources that are available. We saw through session 2, Jamaro and a lot of the other panelists, Francesco and Nathan Earl, they challenged us to look at the person inside the boot, for us to stand up, for us to look down and examine the boots that we're wearing, and how we can take those boots and march right into the conversations in our communities for people who identify as us and people who don't identify as us. And when we see just even the advantages that we have in our own respective groups, making sure that we're speaking up for those who may not have that strong of a voice just yet, and making sure that we're pushing against stereotypes, we're pushing against cultural norms to provide the best care as possible. And of course, the importance of making sure we ask twice as much as we tell survivors as we're leading these efforts and as we're serving in all these different capacities that we're in, not just including, but the conversation is about them. How can we have the conversation without them, and making sure that we're doing the most possible, honestly, and not so much of a pretty word, a way to just shut up and listen sometimes. And then to take what we've learned while we're listening, and to be able to make sure that we're moving forward in the best capacity as individuals, as organization, as agency, those in law enforcement, those on the prosecuting side, those who are helping on the healing work, because it really is going to take everybody working together to ensure that our communities heal and move forward, and eventually eradicate our footprint here as much as we possibly can in our own communities, the human trafficking footprint that we are all a part of. And with that, as you see on the screen, we do have the contact information for all of our panelists for our 3rd session, which was on survivor-centered care and leadership. Next slide. And these next few slides are just some resources where you can find out more information on statistics that were shared, some of the agencies that were mentioned. Maybe you didn't get a chance to write it down, but a lot of our information that many people have shared come from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. So we have missingkids.org and the cyber tip line as well too. Sometimes it might not be in our family or in our circle, but we may have some information that may help save the life for someone else. So we have the cyber tip line. We have information, the American Bar, on how to obtain post-conviction relief for survivors. We have the National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline and the Polaris Project. Again, this presentation will be sent out to everyone. Once you complete the survey, it would automatically generate a completion of this symposium, but it will also include a copy of the slides that was shown here today with all of these resources. Next slide. So here are some organizations, of course, Christie House information here, and all of the partners and those who are represented today. We have the Chance Program. We have Giant Slayer Communication. Nathan Earl, thank you so much. We have Survivors Pathway through Francesco Duberli, making sure that we're not forgetting everyone in this conversation. We do have Glory House, which is a partner of Christie House that is more of a faith-based organization, but they do not discriminate when it comes to providing services. And then of course, Project Gold. And it's just so amazing, all of the work that we're doing here at Christie House, but we cannot do it by ourselves. So here is the information for organizations in Miami for those who are in the Miami area. Next slide. And also the Christie House locations. You can drop by any of these locations, but we're just super grateful to our sponsors and all the fundraising efforts and everyone who does the work at Christie House to be able to have these different locations to provide as many services as possible to those who are in need. As we mentioned in one of the answers in the chat, all you need is simply, as far as in terms of a referral, is for the call of the report to just be made. And from there, whether you choose or someone chooses to move forward, whatever course of action afterwards is not necessary for you and the family to be able to receive services from Christie House. We are clinical based. We do provide clinical based therapy, and it does work. We have the evidence and the results to show that you can move forward from this and move forward and begin your healing journey, not just you as an individual, but the family as a whole. Next slide. And how to get involved. So on our Christie House website, christiehouse.org/trafficking, there are some different resources on how to get involved. A few of you guys have mentioned in the chat, in the Q&A, you want to just do a little bit more. But first, we want to thank you for being here, because this is the first step. As part of the prevention and education team, we truly do believe, and we know that it works, that education is the best preventive method. Also, someone mentioned in the question and answer, they asked about trainings. Christie House, we do provide trainings. We are generously, we are funded and that allows for us to be able to provide these trainings completely free at no cost to you or to any group as well too, on various topics. We have it on trauma, child abuse, HT, CSEC specifically, and we're able to provide those trainings completely free at cost all year round. So if you go to our website, you'll be able to find more information on that. Next slide. And I do want to mention, as we're going to the next slide, we also put the cyber tip line because we never want to get someplace and just assume that everybody knows how to report. We did put the cyber tip line on there because if you don't know what to do, or you do suspect any trafficking may be taking place and you may not know, we don't assume that just because we work in this field or you're on this presentation that we know everything. So if you would go to the cyber tip line, that is a way for you to be able to report. In the state of Florida, every adult is a mandated reporter. So 1-800-96-ABUSE for any type of abuse that's taking place as it pertains to children, for the appropriate organizations to be able to follow up. And our survey. So you've heard us mention several times the survey. We need you guys to complete the survey, please, and thank you. The survey, we do provide it to our funders, which does allow us to be able to provide these trainings completely free of charge. And also, we want to make sure that we're effective. Like, how great are we doing any of this work if we're not being effective in it, and making sure that we can provide the information. So if you take a time to complete the survey, if you have not already done so. And Teresa, you wanted to? Okay, saw your hand up. Next slide. And so, yes, so all of this would not be possible if we did not have a team. Again, we cannot do this without everybody coming together to make sure that this is a success. Of course, Deborah, who is moderating with me, who is a director of prevention education. You have myself, Jessica Hylton, my contact information there. Behind the scenes, we have Civil Bonhomme and Patricia Zedler, who are both prevention education specialists as well, who have been working, we all have been working diligently to ensure that this symposium goes smoothly and that we're providing the most relevant information as it does pertain to trends, strides, and gaps in HT.
Yes. Big shout out to the prevention education team. Thank you, ladies,
Yes.
for having my back. Appreciate you very much.
And Laura.
And Laura. Yes.
Yes. So thank you again to everyone, to all of our panelists. We thank you. We know that we could spend hours and days speaking on this topic, but we thank you for taking time out of your schedules to be here, especially during January, which is Human Trafficking Awareness Month. And it's not just something for us to just put it on a t-shirt, but for us to make sure that we're actually doing the work here. We thank you to everyone who has attended, who thought it not robbery, as we would say in church, to be here and participate in this training. So many good nuggets, so much information, and so many resources available, so that way we can make sure that survivors are doing just that, not just surviving, but thriving in their lives and moving forward, as this is something that has happened to them, but doesn't have to define who they are. And that is all. If Deborah, you have anything to add, or if anyone has anything to add.
I say thank you very much, everyone. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the team. Thank you for Christy House and Project Gold. Happy Friday, everyone. Stay safe. If anyone else would like to say good afternoon, okay. I'm checking out. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.